Hello, this is What If Luffy and Zoro Went Back in Time Together. Please like and subscribe to my channel and check out the author and the fanfiction linked in the description. Please enjoy. Wapol's face was a mix of terror and fury as he faced the three commoners who refused to let him pass. He still hadn't gotten past his fear at seeing his best soldiers brutally beaten barehanded, as if they were nothing. After seeing that he had made a break for the Drum Rockies, intent on reaching the safety of his castle. If Chess and Karamarimo had to be sacrifices to ensure his well-being, then so be it. But upon ascending the mountain, he had found his passage to his own castle, blocked by the sole surviving doctor of Drum Kingdom, the Yeti that had tried to attack him 6 years ago before being stopped by Dalton, and that infuriating pirate who had had the audacity to kick him into the sea and steal his eternal pose. In short, he was surrounded by treason. He gritted his teeth in frustration. He now had no choice but to take his country back himself. His subordinates may have been thrashed, but he was the king. He couldn't be beaten by commoners. He had the divine right to rule by blood. Get out of my way. Wapol commanded. What right do you have to so casually take residence in the king's castle, you witch? King's castle? Kuriha repeated with an innocent expression. You must be mistaken. When I found this castle it was completely empty. It was clearly abandoned. So I took it. Well, I'm claiming it back. Wapol screamed in outrage. So unless you want to be executed, leave my home. Letting us off so easily? Kuriha said with a smirk. That seems unlike you. I'd go as far as to say you're out of your comfort zone without those two brats following you around and fighting your battles for you. Where are those idiots anyway? So it looks like you really intend to defy me, Wapol said quietly. It doesn't matter if Chess and Karamarimo have been defeated. I'll take back my kingdom on my own. He seemed irrational at this point. Kuriha frowned. Defeated? Those two. Wapol's two head officers were sole reason why the populace had been helpless against Wapol's tyranny. Dalton could stand up to them, but even he couldn't take them both at once. The only one in all of Drum Kingdom that could achieve such a feat was her own medical apprentice. Kuriha's eyes idly wandered over to the kid with the straw hat that was standing next to them, seemingly without a care in the world. Something clicked in her brain. He had called her current patient his crewmate. That meant he wasn't alone. She was broken out of her thoughts as Wapol finally made his move. He charged forward, most likely intent on swallowing them whole. He was intercepted by Chopper who met his charge in his reindeer form before shifting into his full zone form as he tackled Wapol. The king fell back with Chopper hovering over him. His fist was reared back, ready to strike, but he didn't. He hesitated, then spoke. Doctor was convinced that even you were worth saving, he said quietly before raising his voice. If you leave now, I won't hurt you. Luffy pouted. That wouldn't end well. He wanted to see that punch happen. Kuriha called out to him, calling him a fool, and Wapol, though confused, took the opportunity to extend his jaw and attempt to bite Chopper. He bit into thin air though, and looked up to see the reindeer being yanked back by an outstretched arm. You? So you've eaten a devil fruit as well? Wapol shouted. Chopper looked at Luffy in uncertainty. Thank you, he said. Luffy grinned and flashed him a thumbs up before speaking. I can tell you want to beat this guy, but you're hesitating, he said. Chopper's head perked up at this, and Kuriha watched intently. You want to save this country, right? Luffy asked. Chopper nodded eagerly. This was the country that doctor had been so intent on saving. Even if it had caused him to suffer, he would carry on that last wish of his. Then you can't do that, Luffy continued. You can't hesitate. I know you think that everybody has the potential to bring good to the world, but if you want to make a difference, you have to be firm in your resolve. Chopper pondered this statement as he thought back to the conversation he had had with this human earlier that day. Wait up, reindeer. Luffy shouted as he chased Chopper down the hall. The human reindeer kept running, crying hysterically in reaction to being chased by a human. Leave me alone, you damn human. He yelled in fear. No way. You're not getting away. Luffy yelled jovially. Finally Chopper turned around, changed into his own form. I said, get lost, jerk. He shouted, ramming Luffy's head with both fists. Luffy's head rocked back and his neck seemed to stretch before Chopper's eyes. He looked on in shock. He hadn't hit him that hard. His rising guilt at seemingly having just broken someone's neck was replaced by fear again when the man's head snapped back into place and he looked back at Chopper, grinning. Won't work. He yelled. Chopper fell back. What kind of human are you? He asked. Luffy responded quickly to the routine question. I'm a rubber man, he said simply. Chopper suddenly understood. He had eaten a devil fruit. Did that make this guy a monster, like him? What do you want from me? He asked indignantly now that he'd finally been caught. I already told you. Join my pirate crew. We need a doctor, Luffy said. Chopper found the offer to join a pirate crew very interesting, but suppressed his interest. Just because he was a pirate, that didn't change anything. "I won't," he said. "I know what you humans think of me. You all think I'm a monster," he shouted. Luffy just kept smiling at him. "Yay, you're a monster," he confirmed without hesitation. Chopper gritted his teeth. He had come to expect this reaction, but that didn't make it much easier to hear. "But who cares? So am I," Luffy continued. Chopper looked at him in slight curiosity. "What kind of idiot calls himself a monster?" he asked. "Well, I can't really deny it at this point," Luffy said in an amused tone. "Even my crew says it to my face." The casual way that he admitted something like that confused Chopper, who blinked in surprise. He couldn't imagine Doctor or Doctorine ever calling him a monster. They were the only ones who had ever accepted him. "Your own crew? And you're okay with that?" he asked, his usual shyness overridden by his confusion. "Of course," Luffy said with conviction. "Being a monster just means that I can protect them better. If I had to choose between being a monster who could protect what was precious to me and a normal human who couldn't be relied on, I'd choose monster without a second thought. That's why I strive to become stronger." Chopper froze at these words. He had never thought of it that way. He had things he wanted to protect as well. Was that what he had to choose between? Being accepted and being able to protect what was precious? If so, he couldn't really fault this guy's logic. He would choose to be a monster as well. Every time. Chopper brought his gaze back to Wapol, and his eyes became focused. "There's so much I have to learn if I want to protect them," he thought. "I didn't know there would be this much to it." He slowly pulled a small yellow bowl out of his pocket and stared at it. "Being a monster just means I can protect them better. I choose monster without a second thought." The words echoed in his mind and his eyes hardened. He tossed a pill into his mouth and chewed. Rumble. Kariha watched in fascination as Chopper's entire demeanor changed. When had he become so determined? It was as if his troubles had disappeared. She snuck another glance at Luffy. "Why did you come out here, kid? Just to give pep talks?" she asked. Luffy turned to her and grinned. "Oh, I'm just here to watch the show," he said as Chopper charged forward in walk point. Wapol was taken aback by his sudden increase in speed but was ready this time. "It won't work. You forget that one of my officers used to be his own as well. I already know how your power works." He knew the reindeer was going to change to his Zone form to throw another punch and got ready to swallow him whole. He was quite surprised when instead he changed into a new form, one with huge horns. His eyes widened before his mouth got caught on the large antlers and Chopper continued, undeterred. Wapol began sliding through the snow until Chopper finally bucked, sending him sailing through the air. He landed and continued sliding, coming to a stop just short of the cliff before getting up again. "So then that's your hybrid form. Well, now I've seen them all," he said as he wiped the blood off his chin. Luffy smiled wryly, his expression a mix of "I know something you don't know" and "you're about to get fucked." This did not escape Kariha's notice. "Behold. The true power of the Baku Baku no Mi," Wapol yelled as he transformed into what appeared to be a house with cannons for arms. This surprised Chopper, but he pressed on. He couldn't afford to waste precious rumble time. As Wapol aimed both cannons at him, he quickly switched to guard point. The small cannons hit him dead on, only to have no effect. He switched to jump point and leapt right at Wapol, who was stunned at having seen 5 different forms now, before switching to arm point after the jump. Hakute, Rizao. Chopper's hooves embedded themselves into Wapol's stomach, leaving a visible imprint. Wapol coughed up blood and stumbled back, but regained his balance. He glared at Chopper in outrage and aimed his cannons at him again. This time Chopper dodged the aim using jump point, soaring high above Wapol's head. Wapol looked up in surprise as he increased his weight using heavy point and fell upon him like a boulder. Wapol raised his cannons too late and Chopper landed another hit. Hakute, Diamond. Wapol grit his teeth as he was plunged deep into the snow. 6 forms now. When would it end? He didn't have time to think about it though, as Chopper was preparing for another attack. As he charged, Wapol raised his cannons and shot from his awkward position. Chopper switched once again to guard point and winced at the impact, knowing he couldn't take too many hits like that. He landed and finally switched to brain point, which only seemed to infuriate Wapol more as he pulled himself out of the snow. 7 forms. Scope, Chopper whispered as he scanned for Wapol's weak point. He soon found it and chastised himself for not realizing it sooner. "It's over," he said confidently. "You won't get up after this next attack." "Keep dreaming, reindeer," Wapol growled. "Your pathetic attacks won't bring me down." Chopper wasted no more time. He had 30 seconds left. He switched back and forth between walk point and jump point as he dodged the aim of the cannon fire. Finally he jumped right into Wapol's face and switched to arm point one last time. Wapol grinned. "Fool. Going for my face is suicide." He opened his mouth wide and attempted to crush Chopper between his jaws, but Chopper was undeterred, having expected it. Before he could chomp down, Chopper sank his hooves into the back of Wapol's throat. Kakute, cross. Wapol choked upon impact and his eyes rolled back into his head before he fell backwards onto the snow, unmoving. Chopper sighed. 3 minutes, he thought with satisfaction as he changed back to his hybrid form, panting lightly. Nice one, Chopper. Luffy called out. Chopper looked at him in surprise before a sheepish, happy expression came onto his face. Shut up. Complimenting me won't make me happy, you bastard. He said in a very happy tone. As he swayed back and forth comically, Kariha contemplated what had just happened. This man was most likely the cause of Chopper's sudden boost of confidence. That was the only explanation. Not only that, but he seemed to have a large amount of confidence in the reindeer, as if he knew he'd win. Where had that come from? She had overheard one of his attempts to recruit Chopper into his crew of pirates. She idly wondered if he'd be successful. The wound in Chopper's heart couldn't be easily healed, but considering the progress he already seemed to be making, it didn't seem so far-fetched. Chopper seemed more comfortable in his own skin. Dalton-san, that's Wapol. Kariha turned to the voice and saw Dalton and a group of villagers arriving at the top of the mountain in the cable lift. Most of them were staring at Wapol's unconscious form in shock. Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji, who had also arrived, were all coming to similar conclusions, except for Zoro who had a contemplative look on his face as he noted the hoof imprints on Wapol's torso. Dr. Kariha. Dalton called, turning to the amused woman. What happened here? Who subdued Wapol? That would be my apprentice, Kariha said, pointing to the human reindeer who was currently hiding behind a tree with his entire body exposed. The Strawats were a bit confused, having assumed it was Luffy. Dalton's eyes widened as he recognized Chopper. He's the one who tried to attack Wapol after the death of Dr. Hiluluk. Is he really the one who defeated him? When the realization hit him, he fell to both knees. Chess and Karamarimo had been defeated as well. This meant that finally, their country could be reborn. He bowed his head to the ground and faced Chopper. You have my thanks. Now we can start anew. The reindeer looked startled and unsure of what to do in the face of his gratitude until the villagers started freaking out over the sight of him. Once the word monster was let loose despite Dalton's discouragement, Chopper stepped out with a pained but resolved look on his face. So what if I'm a monster? He shouted. Even if I am, if I can protect everybody, I'm satisfied. Even if I can't be with everyone or make friends, if I can keep Dr. Hiluluk's dream alive, I have no regrets. The villagers were stunned at this, not only at the fact that the alleged monster was talking to them, but also at what it was conveying. Dalton wore a pained expression at the thought of Hiluluk's death. The man had given his life to keep hope alive in Drum Kingdom, but here was his successor right in front of them, having vanquished the tyrant that threatened the man's dream, claiming that he would gladly live the life that had been forced on him if it meant protecting those that had forced it on him. The people who claimed that Dalton was this country's savior knew so little. What are you talking about, idiot? A voice came, breaking him out of his thoughts. Of course you can make friends. Take a good look, he said as he walked up and stood beside his crewmates. We're your friends from now on, and there's one more of us too, so get used to it. Now get over here and join our crew already. The Strawats all perked up and took a good look at Chopper. So that little guy is joining our crew? Nami asked. Is he a doctor? We really need one. Bit of an oddity, isn't he? Sanji commented. Well, not that I care. What's with the weird nose? Usopp asked hypocritically. Zoro stayed silent, simply taking a long look at Chopper as the reindeer stared at Luffy in shock before finally shaking his head stubbornly. I can't. Chopper yelled back. I want to, but it's impossible. I'm not like you. Regret filled his voice as the words left his mouth. Who cares? Luffy shouted back with stubbornness in equal measure. You think any of us are normal? We're all a sailing circus. Before anyone could attempt to refute this statement, Luffy pointed at Zoro. I mean, look at this guy. My first mate drinks all night, sleeps all day, and then claims he doesn't get hangovers. Zoro let this comment slide as he continued to observe Chopper. Luffy pointed to Nami next. You ever heard the phrase put your money where your mouth is? Well, our navigator puts her money where her eyes are. I have no idea how she does it to this day. Nami had half a mind to interrupt his rant with a solid punch, but sighed, knowing full well that he was right. Luffy moved on to Usopp. Our sniper could lie 1,000 times during a lie detector test, and if his lies weren't so ridiculous, you'd never even know he was lying. Usopp swelled with pride and stood straighter, taking this as a compliment. Luffy then pointed at Sanji. And our chef will kick you through a wall for chewing with your mouth open, while simultaneously flirting with the first woman he lays eyes on. Sanji shrugged indifferently, not bothering to deny it. Luffy pointed to himself. And me, I'm the most monstrous guy you'll ever meet in your life, so don't act like that doesn't make you a contender. Finally, Luffy pointed at Chopper. So give me one good reason why you shouldn't join our crew and come on adventures with us. Chopper's eyes had been filling with tears throughout the speech as his shell of stubbornness started to crack. But I'm a reindeer. I have hooves and antlers. And a blue nose. Don't you care? He asked doubtfully. Reindeers are cool, your hooves and antlers have proven useful, and your blue nose is funny. Luffy said with a straight face. Chopper's jaw dropped as his remaining reasons for not joining were shot down one by one. So no, I don't care, Luffy concluded. Now shut up and let's go. The dam seemed to break at these words, and Chopper was reduced to a fit of hysterical crying. The villagers and Dalton, who had stayed silent throughout the confrontation, looked on in wonder. From behind the castle wall, VV smiled faintly, having heard the entire thing. Will you stop your infernal crying and make up your mind? Koreha said with a scoff. Are you going or not? Chopper attempted to compose himself and turned to her. I'm sorry Doctorine. I want to go with them, he said as he sniffed. I appreciate everything you've done for me over the years and I'll never forget it, but he trailed off as the goodbye became too much for him. Koreha waved her hand. Fine. Good riddance then, she said nonchalantly. Inwardly, her heart clenched as she turned away from him and walked back to the castle. On the way, she crossed paths with VV, who was trying to cover up her attempts to sneak away. They locked eyes, and Koreha looked at her with a blank expression as VV started to sweat. The Strawwats heard a crash coming from the castle, accompanied by what sounded like VV screaming frantically. Luffy let out a loud laugh as Nami, Usopp, and Sanji stiffened in worry. Oh yay, there's still that. Be right back. He walked toward the castle. Get everyone onto the ship while I get extract VV, he said. The Strawwats looked hesitant but complied and headed down the mountain via the cable lift. Luffy headed into the castle to find VV struggling to escape the grasp of Koreha, who had her pinned to the floor. As much as I'd like to see how this plays out, we really need to get going soon, he informed the doctor. Koreha turned to him in annoyance. Going? Don't be ridiculous. I meant it when I said that my patients don't leave until they're healthy or dead. And don't forget about my payment either. Once she's completely cured, I'll expect full compensation, Koreha said. About that, Luffy began. This next move would make him feel really guilty, and he wouldn't pull it if he didn't know that they had to get to Alabasta fast. Since it was actually Chopper who treated her, and he's our crewmate now, doesn't that mean we should just discuss the matter of the fee with him? Koreha's eyes narrowed, as she had an idea where this was going. And since she's technically his patient and not yours, that means she can leave as long as Chopper monitors her condition on the ship, doesn't it? Koreha gritted her teeth, but got off of VV. I guess I can't argue with logic, now can I? She said before scoffing. Luffy tossed her a small metallic object, which she caught on reflex. This is a key to the armory, Luffy confirmed. I got it off of Wapol's unconscious body. Figured you might want it. Well, isn't that great? You take my assistant and smart talk your way out of payment, but at least I've got this, right? Her voice was dripping with sarcasm. Get out of here kid, she said as she turned around. Never come back if you know what's good for you. As she walked away, Luffy called after her, his voice serious now. Thank you for everything, he said sincerely. I promise I'll do what's best for him and help him fulfill his dream. Koreha froze in place, and Luffy noticed that she had started to tremble. Suddenly she spun around. I told you to get the hell out of here, you fucking brat. Now leave before I change my mind. She shouted with bloodshot eyes. Luffy signaled to VV, and the two quickly made their way out of the castle. When they got to the edge of the mountain, the lift was already gone. Luffy hoisted VV onto his back, and VV paled as she realized how they were going to get down. She resisted the urge to scream as Luffy took them across the mountainside and down to ground level using Geppu. When they finally got back to the Going Merry, she was panting furiously. As they made their way onto the ship, Luffy noticed Chopper's troubled expression. He didn't know what the reindeer was thinking about, but he had a hunch that whatever loose ends he was dealing with would be tied up soon. I'd keep an eye on that mountain if I were you, Chopper, he said with a grin. Chopper looked up at him curiously and then turned back to the Drum Rockies. It wasn't long before all of the snow in a large circular vicinity of the center mountain turned pink from whatever chemical was adhering to it. From this distance, the entire mountain bore a striking resemblance to a massive sakura tree in full bloom. Damn, Usopp whistled. Wow, VV breathed in awe. It's amazing, Nami said. You said it, Sanji said as he looked up at the sight. Chopper, unable to contain himself, burst out crying again and continued to do so even as their ship pulled away from Drum Island. Chopper watched in fascination as the rest of the Strawwats went through their usual antics. Luffy was yelling at Sanji for food, Zoro was encouraging Chopper to drink with him, Nami was yelling at Zoro to stop being a bad influence on the impressionable reindeer. Usopp was offering a toast to their new crewmate while simultaneously telling him a story about the 50-meter-tall abominable snowman he had fought in Drum. Sanji was yelling at Luffy to stop yelling at him for food and to just wait 5 damn minutes for it to cook, and Vivi was sitting next to Chopper, watching them all with an amused smile. "They're pretty lively, huh?" she asked Chopper. Chopper nodded his agreement. He had never seen people with so much energy before. It was really like watching a circus. Not that he'd ever seen one, but he'd heard about them. "What's the big deal, Nami? If you're old enough to be a straw hat, you're old enough to drink," Zoro said sagely. "Even if that were true, he's too cute to be drinking with you idiots," she said firmly as she pointed at Zoro. "So I guess that doesn't apply to you then?" Zoro said with a smirk. He was promptly knocked to the deck head first by Nami's fist. He got up and laughed, ignoring the throb in his skull. "You're just proving me right, you know." Nami looked annoyed enough to continue doing just that until Chopper walked up and grabbed a sake bottle. "I want to try it," he said, smiling widely. Zoro grinned at victory as Nami looked at Chopper skeptically. "Have you ever actually had alcohol before?" she asked. "Nope," Chopper admitted. "But alcohol is okay in moderation. As long as you don't have too much, the body can cleanse it from the bloodstream without any long-term effects," he said, remembering what he'd read over the years. "Right," Nami said with a smirk. "Alright, go on then." She motioned for him to drink with her hand. Chopper brought the sake bottle to his lips with both hands and started chugging. After about a second, his face turned blue and he dropped the bottle, gagging and coughing. His tongue hung from his mouth and he had a traumatized look on his face. Luffy and Zoro started laughing out loud and even Nami giggled. "So, how was the first drink?" Nami asked tauntingly. Chopper, not one to note sarcasm, responded as if it was an actual question. "It was nasty," he shouted. "It's even worse than my rumble balls. You guys drink that stuff for fun." "Not me," Nami replied. "I usually just drink when it earns me money." "What wouldn't you do for money?" Zoro asked as his laughter died down. "Refrain from punching you," Nami suggested. Zoro blinked in recognition. "Oh, that is something," he was interrupted as he was once again sent plummeting to the deck head first. "Damn which," Zoro said aloud from a seated position as Nami walked away to check the course. The Straw Hats continued partying well into the night before they finally went to sleep. Luffy looked out over the horizon with lifeless eyes as the island finally came into view. "Zoro," he whispered. The swordsman awoke from his trance and looked as well. As the island drew closer, he snuck a glance at Luffy. He wasn't surprised by what he saw, but that didn't make it easier. There was no joy. There was no evidence of the achievement in Luffy's eyes. There was only the same dead look that he had been adorning since the incident. He couldn't really blame his captain for that, but if this couldn't evoke any response from him, then what could? Luffy had been looking forward to this moment for most of his life, but as he took his first step onto the island he knew could only be Raftel, he felt no sense of accomplishment. Only shame. Pirate King and One Piece meant next to nothing now. Everything that it symbolized to him had been broken. There was no freedom to be found anymore. Because they would never obtain that freedom. Nami would never draw a world map. Usopp would never meet his father and stand with him on equal footing as a brave warrior of the sea. Sanji would never find all blue. Topper would never prove to the world that there was no incurable disease. Robin would never find the Rio poneglyph. Frankie would never witness the Thousand Sunny take them all around the world. Brook would never return to Reverse Mountain to meet Laboon. And Jin, who had met his end before he could even join, would never see fishmen and humans stand side by side in the sun. It was too much to bear. He had failed them all. And yet he kept trudging forward to fulfill his now empty dream, simply because Sanji's last words would never stop repeating themselves in his head. Zoro hopped off the Sunny and started walking after Luffy. He knew what his captain was feeling. He just didn't seem to have the same drive to pursue the title of world's greatest anymore. But if he stopped now, shit, how could he stop now? How could he shame them all like that? They both took a long look at the full breadth of the island. Most of it was jungle, and in the center was a cone-shaped mountain that seemed to tower as high as the red line. The top was obscured by the clouds. As they could think of only one place to get started, they quickly made their way through the jungle and over to the mountain. The jungle was strange, they noticed. There didn't seem to be animal life anywhere. In fact, the entire island was completely silent. When they began to ascend the mountain, a peculiar calm seemed to wash over them both. Once they finally reached the top, they felt serene, as if all of their troubles could simply vanish. They knew this was not the case, but somehow they couldn't escape the feeling that everything would work out in the end. It felt strange, to say the least. Walking across the summit, they spotted a gigantic cave off in the distance. They were ready to go check what was inside when Luffy froze mid-step. Zoro looked at him in confusion. His eyes were wide as he stared ahead of them. Zoro traced the path of his eyesight, but saw nothing other than the cave. Luffy was seeing something different, however. He continued to stare in awe at the grinning face of the eternal Pirate King, Gold D. Roger. "You did well to get here, kid. It seems as though you are indeed the one I was waiting for. No one else would be able to perceive my incorporeal form." As the legendary man spoke, his mouth did not move and the smile continued to decorate his features as the words reached his successor. Luffy, who had said nothing up to this point, finally responded. "You're alive?" he asked in wonder. Although he heard his own voice, his lips did not move either. Roger's grin widened and the sound of a rich laughter protruded from his being. "Not exactly," he confessed. "What you're perceiving is simply the voice of my spirit that lingers here. Having the ability to hear the voice of all things, you are a unique case. How weird is it? In a sense you're seeing a ghost, you know." Luffy didn't respond and Roger continued. "Like I said, you did well to get here. And yet, I sense that your will has been compromised. That's quite a shame. One with an ambition as great as yours must have been through quite a lot to lose their drive. What kind of regrets are haunting you?" Luffy looked down at the ground. "I lost my comrades on the way here," he said numbly. "I see," Roger said gravely. "That's very unfortunate. When I met my end, my comrades were still alive and well, so I'm not sure what comfort I can bring." He paused. "Tell me, do you still desire my wealth and treasures? Does your heart still yearn for One Piece?" Luffy looked into his eyes and shook his head. This was not how it was supposed to go. He couldn't honestly say yes to that question. "The only reason I'm here right now is so that I don't waste the sacrifices of those who died for me. I don't want their deaths to be in vain," he said. Roger stared long and hard at Luffy, as if assessing him, before the smile slowly crept its way back onto his face. "Kid, I'm going to give you two options. Option 1. You walk into that cave behind me and inherit wealth, fame, and power beyond your wildest dreams." He paused for a few seconds and then continued. "Option 2. You turn away from your dream for now and I give you a chance to do it all again." As he finished, Luffy stared at him blankly, not comprehending option 2 at all. Roger raised an eyebrow at him. "What, too vague?" "I'm offering to send you back in time so you can do right by your comrades," he said. Luffy stilled, his mouth agape and his eyes wider than they had ever been before. "Can you do that?" he asked quietly. Roger nodded. "You'd be surprised at what I can do. I've long since transcended the laws of the living. The payoff, of course, is that I'm dead." He threw back an head and laughed. "So, what do you think? Option 1 or option 2? Luffy didn't hesitate. "Option 2," he said numbly, still in shock that this was happening. He wasn't one to not believe in something just because it defied common sense, not at all. But this seemed far too good to be true. He could save them. "Alright then," Roger said. He was grinning, as if satisfied with Luffy's decision. "You might want to explain what's going on to your friend first. He's been calling your name for the past 2 minutes. Probably thinks you're batshit insane by now." Luffy awoke from his trance and his head spun towards Zoro. The swordsman stared at him in a mix between annoyance and concern. "What the hell's with you?" he asked. "You were completely out of it there." Luffy immediately launched into an explanation of what had just happened, what he had just learned, and what they could do now. Zoro stayed silent, taking it all in. He was clearly skeptical. "Well, assuming this can be done, I'm all for it," he said, scoffing. "But that's a pretty big assumption." Despite his pessimism, Luffy could clearly see the fire that had manifested in Zoro's eyes. Luffy smiled for the first time in what felt like ages. "Alright, let's do it," he shouted. Zoro scoffed again and threw his hands in the air, smiling despite himself. "Alright, let's see what you can do, Pirate King." Right after he said this, his body immediately dissipated into nothingness. Luffy stared in shock at where his first mate had previously been standing. "What the hell happened?" "Oh, that's right," Roger said. "The body can't handle the mind being forcefully stripped away from it and transferred like that, so it vanishes in the process. Don't worry though, you'll both awaken in your old bodies. Did I forget to mention that? I guess I forgot to mention that." Luffy was too thrilled to be annoyed right now, so he let it go as Roger grinned sheepishly. "I've chosen a moment that was significant to you to transfer your consciousness back to. It's easier that way," Roger stated. He paused. "The third one will be difficult, but I think I can manage," he added ambiguously. "Have fun." Before Luffy could question what he meant by that, his body dissolved and he knew no more. Luffy opened his eyes and sat up in his bed. He sighed and got up, walking out the door onto the Going Merry's deck. Another night without sleep. Oh well. He looked up at the stars and smiled. "So far so good, Roger." "Alright strawwats, gather around." Luffy yelled as his crewmates yawned and made their way out onto the deck. "Nami tells me we're a few hours away from Alabasta," Luffy began. "So I'd like to know how all of you are progressing. The hockey training is going about as well as I hoped, what with having a new learner and all." Chopper had readily begun the hockey training when he was told of it, all too eager to join the rest of the crew in their endeavors, however unconventional they were. But none of you have had any real breakthroughs yet, and you won't be able to rely on that in the upcoming fight. Luckily we accounted for this ahead of time, and we've been playing to each of your strengths as well. He turned to Nami. How's the weapon that you and Usopp were working on coming? He asked. It's done, she answered. We finished it last night. Usopp nodded in confirmation. Alright, good. Make sure you learn how to use it though. You don't want any surprises if you end up fighting someone who's a threat. Nami seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. Luffy turned to Usopp next. And how's the expansion going? He asked the sniper. Usopp grinned widely. Oh, it's going. He said proudly. I've once again increased the intensity and area of effect of my explosive star. I also consulted Chopper, and he gave me a variety of poisons that I've worked into my arsenal. They won't see it coming. Chopper had been reluctant to use his medical knowledge for something like that, but it agreed when he was told it was to help save VV's country, on the condition that Usopp keep a variety of antidotes as well. Luffy seemed satisfied with his answer and addressed Sanji and Chopper next. And how's your training coming along? He asked the chef. Sanji shrugged. About as well as it can be, he said. Luffy knew Sanji hadn't trained much during the previous timeline, with the exception of the 2 years that they had been apart. He had always seemed to keep up anyway though, despite being more laid back about it. This time, Luffy wanted to see how strong the chef could get if he devoted more time to increasing his strength, so he had instructed him to start joining Zoro in his individual training on top of the hockey exercises. Zoro reported that his kicks were starting to gain more power and that he was definitely getting faster. This had been good news to Luffy, but he'd been especially proud when Chopper had noticed them both during their training sessions and eagerly asked if he could join. Even disregarding Luffy and Zoro's strength, which, with the exception of Zoro's duel with Mihawk, hadn't been pushed to the limit since they had arrived in the past, the crew was starting to become significantly stronger than it had been at this time in Luffy's previous life. Luffy and Zoro had discussed it and agreed that they would have to keep it up. They would be ready for anything when the waves got rough. Even Vivi had been working on refining the skills she'd been forced to acquire while infiltrating Baroque works. Once Chopper had confirmed that she was fully recovered, Nami had guiltily shown her the newspaper that she had been hiding. Upon reading that thousands of Royal Army soldiers had joined the efforts of the rebel army, she had been distraught. She was increasingly nervous on the route to Alabasta, and the Straw Hats could do little to comfort her other than come up with a plan. Alright, then we should talk about what we're going to do when we reach Alabasta, Zoro said. Luffy and I have talked about it with VV, and we all agreed on the course of action. Our first priority is to get in contact with the rebel army. VV knows their leader, and she'll be able to convince him not to engage in the civil war once he learns who is really behind it all. Still, we don't want to put all our hopes into that plan. Crocodile currently has Alabasta in a vice grip, and there's a good chance that he'd find a way to start the war regardless. If that happens, we move on to Plan B. Plan B? Nami questioned. You guys are actually coming up with multiple plans, as if one wasn't enough of a miracle. That's right, Witch. We need to be prepared. We're going up against a warlord who has a lot of influence in Alabasta. Plan B is simple. Take down Baroque works and subdue Crocodile so that we can stop the war without any of their meddling. Nami, Usopp and Chopper looked a little nervous about Plan B, but simply nodded. Zoro sighed. Truth be told, if he and Luffy had their way, that would have been Plan A. But VV had insisted that they refrain from doing something that reckless until she was able to get in contact with Koza. She was still pretty naive in that regard, but the real problem was that she didn't want their lives to be at risk fighting Baroque works. But she had at least acknowledged that Crocodile most likely wouldn't stand by and watch them stop the war, so she had agreed to the backup plan. It was another 3 hours before the Straw Hats caught their first sign of Alabasta in the form of a fleet of Baroque works billion ships. This will be tough, VV said, as a bead of sweat rolled down her face. These guys are different than the hired bounty hunters. With that many ships, if they notice us. They won't be a problem, Zoro said. VV looked at him worriedly. Are you sure? This isn't like what happened in Whiskey Peak. We're at sea, and they have us surrounded. VV-chan's right, Sanji said. I have no doubt we can beat them all eventually, but we'll just waste time and draw attention to ourselves. For now we should just ignore them and get to the island. We only need to engage if they notice us. No, like Zoro said, they won't be a problem, Luffy spoke up. I just put them all into comas. They'll be out for a week. The Straw Hats' reactions to this statement varied. Nami and VV looked disbelieving, Usopp and Chopper looked awed, and even Sanji looked shocked, although he kept a moderately neutral expression. Zoro just smirked at their reactions. Chopper was the first to speak. You can do that, Luffy. He shouted. Was it with that hockey stuff you told me about? Luffy had already explained what Conqueror's hockey was to Chopper while going over the basics of hockey again before he joined the training. Yep, that's it, Luffy responded. So cool. Usopp and Chopper shouted simultaneously, only to be yelled at by Nami. Don't believe him so easily. How could he just knock out all those people from all the way over here? How long will you continue to underestimate our captain? He can do a lot more than this, Zoro commented. That was only about 200 people, Luffy stated. Even if they were spread out, that's not enough to push me to my limits. Usopp was deeply impressed. How many people can you knock out then? He gasped. Luffy thought for a moment. It depends. If they were all that weak, I guess about 150,000. Usopp's eyes bugged out of their sockets, Chopper looked at him starry-eyed, Nami was clearly still disbelieving, and Sanji looked a bit disturbed. 150,000. If that's really true, he could defeat the Alabastan royal army single-handedly if given enough time, VV thought. Could such a power really exist? And without the aid of any devil fruit? That's ridiculous. Nami said. You could take down armies without lifting a finger if that was true. Why do you think they call it Conqueror's hockey? Zoro asked lazily. Disregarding the world government and its affiliations, you'll find that the most influential people in this world usually possess the king's will. That's not to say that it's an accurate measure of one's strength, but no one can deny that the ability is what its name implies, a manifestation of one's will to conquer. I can only think of a few exceptions, one of them being this guy, he said as he pointed at Luffy. Really? Usopp asked. But doesn't he want to conquer the Grand Line? I don't really want to conquer anything, Luffy admitted. I don't mind making a name for myself, but in the end that's not really my goal. I just think that the person with the most freedom in this world is the Pirate King. I plan on obtaining that freedom and sharing it with anyone who calls themselves my comrade. Nami couldn't help but smile. She always wondered what Pirate King meant to Luffy. There were two things she could say for sure that she knew the value of. Freedom and money. The world map that she would one day draw wasn't just a means to both, but she'd be lying if she said that the vastness of the open sea wasn't extremely alluring to her. She had to admit, if she was told to choose between fame, power, and freedom, she would always choose the last option. Now if one of the choices was wealth on the other hand. Usopp was actually tearing up. In a way, that was what being a brave warrior of the sea was all about. It had never been the promise of wealth, fame, or power that had attracted him to this life. Before he knew that his father was on a Yonko's crew, and even now, it was always the promise of freedom that lured him out to the sea. There was a reason why before he became a true pirate, he could spend hours just staring out at the infinite waters. Sanji was thinking about Old Blue. Yes, it was a chef's paradise, but now he realized that it was more than that. Deep down, every human being craved freedom. It was a basic human instinct. There was a reason that he never felt completely satisfied on the Barati, and it was the same reason he had stayed there. Although his guilt regarding Zeph was slowly releasing its grip on him, Sanji would never truly forget what he had taken from the old man. But that was also the reason he had left. If Zeph's search for freedom could even be partially fulfilled through him, Sanji would make damn well sure that he lived free as can be. Chopper continued to stare at Luffy in wonder. He thought back to his days with Hiluluk and what the Sakura tree really meant to him. He had long since learned that it would take much more to fulfill his dream to prove there was a cure to every disease, but there was a reason that the Sakura in full bloom was so appealing. He had grown up in a land of eternal snow. As a reindeer, he was satisfied with that, but as a reindeer-human hybrid, there was always a part of him that looked out towards the sea in curiosity and wondered what else the world had to offer. Hiluluk Sakura was the first taste of the vastness of the world, and it would always hold a place within his heart, even if it couldn't literally cure diseases. Now, full speed ahead. Luffy shouted, breaking them all out of their thoughts. To eat at the nearest restaurant. I mean, to save Alabasta. In the center of Nanohana, there was a crowd gathering around a local restaurant. It's getting pretty noisy over there, a white-haired man said as he smoked 2 cigars. Yes, there seems to be quite the commotion, the blue-haired woman next to him replied. Apparently a customer spontaneously died while eating. Captain Smoker. A Marine yelled as he ran towards the Marine captain. You're not going to believe who we found. The Strawwats had docked and were now debating what their first move should be. Zoro suggested that they search the town for any intel on the whereabouts of the rebel army. VV stated that there was no need since she knew their base was in Yuba, but Zoro insisted that they should try to gather information anyway, seeing as she hadn't been back home in a while. This led to VV acknowledging that her information could possibly be out of date, and she agreed. Nami's eyes narrowed. She once again found herself in a position where she couldn't fault his logic, but she still couldn't shake her unfounded suspicions. Zoro usually thought things through, but at best he was a big-picture guy, not a detailed planner. Every now and then though, he showed a surprising degree of attention to detail that even she herself couldn't match. It was almost as if he knew what to look out for. Was she imagining things? She turned to the rest of the crew. None of them seemed to pay it any mind, except for Sanji, who was staring at Zoro curiously. Meanwhile, Luffy had been staring off into the distance, towards the center of town, with an unreadable expression. Zoro broke him out of his trance. "You should go. We'll search for the rebel army and you can meet up with us later," he said. The rest of the crew looked back and forth between Zoro and Luffy in confusion. Luffy rubbed his head sheepishly. "Yay, sorry. I'll be right back," he said. "Where are you going?" Usopp asked. "Don't tell me you're just going to the nearest restaurant to stuff your face." "Believe me, this isn't just any restaurant," Luffy said enthusiastically, causing the entire crew minus Zoro and Sanji to face fault. Zoro tossed a wave over his shoulder as Luffy took off in a high-speed sprint toward the center of town. Sanji stared after him. When Luffy arrived at the restaurant in question, he slowed his pace to a walk. He was close enough now that he could hear the familiar voices inside. What should I do?" one voice said. "You could just sit there and let me arrest you," the second voice suggested. "Rejected," the first one replied. Luffy paused in front of the door and took a deep breath, mentally bracing himself for the coming reunion. "To be honest, I'm not really interested in you. I'm looking for a different pirate," the second voice stated. "You could just let me go," the first suggested. "I can't do that. So long as I'm a marine and you're a pirate." "What a stupid reason. Chill out, man." Luffy walked in. The sound of the door opening instantly gathered the attention of both men and their observers. The two men, who had been seconds away from a confrontation, now stared at the newcomer with wide eyes as he casually walked towards the counter and sat down on nearest stool. "Hey old man, can I get a couple rounds over here?" he asked the bartender. He then pointed to the dumbfounded man in the seat next to him. "This guy's drink is on me," he said. The bartender looked back and forth between the narcoleptic and the newcomer before nodding frantically and pouring 2 cups of sake. Luffy turned to his brother in all but blood and grinned. "So, how have you been, Ace?" he asked. The white-beard pirate was now staring at him with a deadpan expression. "You always knew how to make an entrance, Luffy, but that was another thing entirely," he said as he rubbed his temples. "Well, what can I say? I live to surprise you," Luffy replied. The bartender set 2 cups in front of them and the two of them exchanged cups as their observers watched before proceeding to chug their drinks. "Brings back memories, doesn't it?" Ace asked, reminiscing. "Yay, but it just doesn't feel right until I snatch your food," Luffy said with a smirk. Ace's eyes widened as he looked down at his plate, which was now empty. He sighed in annoyance. "As fast as always I see," he grumbled. He was about to say something else, but they were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Stop ignoring me, you dipshits," Smoker shouted in frustration. Ace and Luffy turned to him in acknowledgement. "Oh yay. Forgot about him," Ace thought. "Geez Smokey. If you really want a drink I'll buy you one too." "Relax," Luffy said. "I've been waiting for this, Straw Hat," the marine captain said, completely ignoring him. "Ever since Lode Town." Smoke started to emanate from his body as he pulled the jut off of his back. Ace looked back and forth between the two in amusement. "You really want to do this? It'll end the same way it did in Lode Town," Luffy said. "Calm down, Smokey. Live life a little. Have some food and chill out." Luffy got his answer in the form of a pillar of smoke rushing towards him. He and Ace both jumped out of the way, but soon found the entire building filling up with smoke. "Maybe we should take this outside, Luffy," Ace suggested. "Good idea. Gum, pistol." Smoker crossed his arms in front of him and blocked the incoming blow, but it still pushed him back out of the restaurant. Luffy quickly caught up to him with a quick Zoro while Ace walked calmly behind them. A crowd was quickly gathering around them, along with a squad of marine soldiers. "Smoker-san," Tashigi yelled as she made her way to the crowd. Her eyes widened when she caught sight of Luffy. "Straw Hat." Smoker got his jut ready again while Ace walked up next to Luffy. "I'm surprised. You can already use hockey," he commented. "I was expecting to have to step in, but I guess you've got this." "Yay, just sit back and relax, Ace. I'll show you something interesting," Luffy replied. "Well, that's no fun. I was looking forward to fighting this guy, but it looks like he's after you, which means I'm stuck with the cannon fodder," Ace said as he took note of the many marine soldiers loading their weapons and taking aim at them. Suddenly the two found themselves being riddled by bullets. Only this didn't achieve the desired effect. The bullets passed harmlessly through Ace's flame body and the marines ended up shooting each other. The bullets that hit Luffy ricocheted off of him and also impacted with the unfortunate soldiers. Now the only marines left standing were Smoker and Tashigi. Smoker looked like he'd had just about enough. "White blow." Luffy sidestepped Smoker's lunge and grabbed him. Halting his momentum, he aimed a punch at the smoke man's torso, only for a hole to open up in the spot where his fist occupied. The smoke quickly closed around his arm, trapping him, and Luffy's senses reminded him to be wary of a certain sea stone jut. He used a Soru to jump back and broke free of the smoke right before said jut crashed down into the pavement where he'd been standing. Smoker lunged at him again, making multiple thrusts with the jut, which were all dodged. Ishigi tried to aid Smoker, but found her path being obstructed by Ace. "Sorry, I kind of want to see how this plays out," the flame man told her. "Would you mind not interfering? You've gotten faster, Smokey. And you've learned from our last encounter," Luffy said. It was true. Smoker wasn't increasing the volume of his body this time, choosing to rely on the speed provided by his devil fruit to trap him. But it's still not enough. Luffy ducked under the next thrust of the jut and kicked Smoker in the face from below, sending him high into the air. Smoker righted himself and hovered in the air using his Loja form as he turned back to his opponent. Only Luffy wasn't on the ground anymore. There was no warning as Luffy's leg impacted with his head from behind and he was sent careening back towards the ground, making a small crater in the pavement. He tried to shake off the cobwebs, realizing he probably had a concussion, but before he could attempt to get up, Luffy's arm shot down like a rocket and embedded itself in his gut. Smoker coughed up a clump of blood and blacked out. "Smoker-san," Tashigi shouted as she tried to get past Ace again. Ace was quick to intercept her at every turn though, and in desperation, she swung her sword at his neck. Ace did nothing to defend himself, and her sword decapitated him, causing her eyes to widen. She quickly realized that she had bigger things to worry about than her morals at the moment though, and rushed over to where Smoker lay unconscious. He had a concussion and a few broken ribs. She thought back to when she had found him like this in Logue Town. His injuries had been more serious then, but to be honest, this situation was much worse. Their entire squad was injured, and there was no way she could get them all out of here, let alone cover their retreat. Ishigi stiffened and turned around to see Luffy standing behind her. She readied her sword again, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't beat Straw Hat. Captain Smoker was far stronger than her, and even he had lost. She couldn't call for backup either. He'd just take that chance to end the fight. The sound of a raging fire drew her attention to the man she had just unwilling killed, only to find him still standing. Her eyes widened in horror as flames converged around his neck and his head reformed. He was a Loja user. "Nice technique," Ace commented lazily. "But without Haki it's useless. And even then you froze up when you killed me. Have you ever taken a life before?" Ishigi gritted her teeth as she realized the situation she was in. Her hands started to tremble from how tightly she was grasping her sword. Luffy took note of this and raised an eyebrow. "What, you two?" he said. "You and Smokey both need to lighten up. I'm not going to kill you even if you hold some stupid grudge against me." He turned and walked away, leaving Tashigi dumbfounded. "Hey Ace. Let me introduce you to my crew. You're gonna love them." Ace's head perked up as he smiled widely. "Now that sounds like a plan. They must be some fascinating folks if they decided to follow you," he said. "Sure are. They're really interesting to say the least. We even have a talking transforming reindeer," Luffy said. The two brothers continued to chat amiably as they walked down the street, leaving an extremely confused Tashigi, an unconscious Smoker, and a squad of injured marine soldiers in their wake. "Would you care to repeat that?" Nami asked with lidded eyes. The Straw Hat crew's faces currently conveyed a myriad of various expressions which included confusion, shock, annoyance, skepticism, excitement, awe, and just about any other emotion that you would expect to see on their faces after their captain just said. "This is my brother, Portgas D. Ace, who you probably know as Firefist, second commander of the Whitebeard Pirates," Luffy repeated for the second time. Silence. For a long moment, unyielding silence. Then. "Stop doing that," Usopp said, causing Luffy to quirk an eyebrow. "Doing Stop. Doing. That." Nami repeated, putting emphasis on each word. A confused Luffy opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused and thought for a moment. "Okay. I'll just stop doing that then," he said, as if that would be the end of the discussion. Nami would have none of it. "And what are you going to stop doing?" she asked, with a tone a mother might use to lecture a child, as Ace looked back and forth between the two, wishing he had a snack for the show. "How the hell should I know?" Luffy mumbled indignantly. "Why don't you tell me? What do I have to stop doing?" "You have to stop delivering shocking news as if you're predicting the weather," Nami shouted in annoyance. "Half an hour ago you told us you could knock out hundreds of people with a single thought, and now you casually mention that you have a brother and that he just happens to be Firefist Ace, a crewmate of the most powerful pirate in the world. Of all the ridiculous things to behold, Usopp's lies are second only to your truths, and he makes a spectacle of them. It's like you have no sense of subtlety whatsoever." Nami started taking deep breaths, her rant finished. Midway through, Ace had shot Luffy a questioning look, most likely in regards to the knockout hundreds of people with a single thought part, but Luffy had just given him a look that said later. Ace had just shrugged, but a ghost of a proud smile could still be seen tugging at his lips. Oh come on Nami, name one other time on second thought, name 5 other times I've done this, Luffy said. You're just proving her point Zoro commented, causing Nami to turn in his direction and point an accusing finger at him. And I'll bet you knew about this, didn't you? She asked. So what if I did? He asked lazily. You gonna charge me interest on my debt of things I'm not obligated to tell you? Nami was about to respond but was interrupted by Ace. Oh. So you did tell at least one of your crewmates about me, he said jovially. And here I thought you'd be an inconsiderate little prick and not even mention me once. Well, once is better than nonce I guess. Oh come on Ace, that's not fair, Luffy whined. I mean, does Whitebeard know about me? Ace rolled his eyes. Luffy, our entire crew knows about you. Said crew has over 100 times more people than yours, not including our allies, and even the new guys learn about you within a few days of joining. Whitebeard himself was in bed with a hangover the morning after your bounty made the papers. Congratulations by the way. In fact, the only member of our crew who wasn't bedridden that morning was our 1st Division commander, and he has regenerative powers. Luffy by now was rubbing the back of his head guiltily. Ah, sorry Ace. I guess I just like to save the news for the occasion. You have to admit, it's pretty entertaining blowing their minds like that, he said as he motioned toward his attentive crew. I knew it. Usopp said enthusiastically. He does do it on purpose. I'd tell you to pay up Nami, but I know better than to take any money from you, and I have no doubts that it would come back to bite my ass if I did. You're right. You'd end up paying me back 10 times over, maybe more depending on my mood, Nami remarked absent-mindedly. So anyway, where are the others? Ace asked curiously. Didn't you say there were 7 of you? There are. A few of us, Vivi, Sanji, and Chopper, are out searching for Alabasta's rebel army, Luffy replied. Ace blinked. I'd ask why one of your crewmates has the same name as this country's missing princess, but I assume it has something to do with why you're searching for the rebel army to begin with. Luffy nodded. We're here to stop a civil war. Ace stared at him curiously. It's not really like you to get caught up in things like that. What brought this on? He asked. Vivi's our comrade, Luffy responded, without missing a beat. If she wants to save her country, we're with her all the way. Ace grinned and nodded in understanding. Well, that sounds like it could be difficult. The rebel army is pretty determined from what I hear. I'm not sure Vivi can persuade them, even if she still has a good standing in Alabasta, Ace said. Vivi knows someone on the inside, Zoro replied. But that's not the real problem. We'll have to take down one of the 7 warlords if we really want to end the war. Ace frowned. You mean Crocodile? What's he have to do with this? He's the one instigating the civil war from the shadows, Zoro said, causing comprehension to dawn on Ace's face. That explains quite a bit actually. Well then, he said, turning to Luffy. How are you planning to beat Crocodile? Do you think you can take him in a straight fight? Usopp and Nami looked at Luffy, silently asking the same question. Of course I can, Luffy said, before pausing. I'll most likely be fighting him in the desert though, so I'll have to be careful. You know about his power then, Ace said, with a hint of surprise in his voice. You're more prepared than I thought you'd be. You've changed quite a bit since I last saw you. Luffy smiled morbidly. You have no idea, he muttered, causing Ace to frown slightly. As quick as it came, Luffy's gloomy mood disappeared, leaving Ace to wonder if it had been there to begin with. Luffy? Gloomy? Was he imagining things? I've changed in more ways than one Ace, Luffy said in a slightly smug tone. It wouldn't be so one-sided this time if we sparred. Ace smirked at the unspoken challenge. Oh really? Just because your first bounty is higher than mine was, you think you can give me a run for my money now? I think I can do a lot more than just that, Luffy replied evenly, although the nonchalance in his tone didn't match the enthusiasm on his face. Zoro couldn't help but mirror their grins as he watched the 2 brothers stare each other down. Well then, Ace began, the confident smile never leaving his face, I'll just have to put that on the list of things we need to talk about later, along with how you awakened all 3 forms of Haki so early, and why both you and him, he said, motioning to Zoro, are both suppressing your auras. He paused. And we might as well throw in since when does Luffy think I'm an idiot while we're at it? Luffy, for his part, was suddenly taking great interest in the clouds overhead, while Usopp stared in confusion and Nami in growing suspicion. Suddenly, Zoro scoffed. Believe me, that's going to be an interesting discussion. Very interesting, Luffy added, still staring at the sky. Chopper, are you sure about that? Vivi asked in a hushed tone as they made their way through the crowded streets of Nanohana. I am, Chopper replied. It's hard to tell because of all the perfume around, but I can still make out the scent of gunpowder. It's really strong. I'm not sure what that could be other than the rebel army, Sanji commented. Anyway, we're lucky. We came across a lead pretty fast. Lead the way, Chopper. Chopper nodded and he took off through an alleyway in Walk Point, Sanji and Vivi trailing behind him. It started to dawn on Vivi what this could mean. If it really was the rebel army, then they were just a hair's breadth away from preventing the war. The relatively uneventful trip back to the ship consisted of Ace dispatching of a group of overly ambitious bounty hunters and beyond that, awkward silence. While Luffy, Zoro, and Ace were content to put off the annoying conversation they all knew was coming until they got back to the ship and Usopp accepted the state of confusion he was in, Nami was inclined to send frequent conspicuous glares in the direction of Luffy and Zoro, making it quite clear that she was not a fan of being left out of the loop. Nami was a suspicious person by nature. She was never given the choice to be anything else. But even though her philosophy was to have a healthy skepticism for, well, everything, she also knew when to have faith in something for what it was. But for better or for worse, having faith in people wasn't something she had made a habit of until just recently. She had faith in facts. She had faith in her experiences. She had faith that there was a very limited number of things she could put her faith in. Her crew was one of them. But to what extent did she trust them? It was a question she hadn't really thought about. Did she trust them to the extent that she trusted north to always be north, south to always be south, 2 and 2 to always make 4? There were some things in life that were constant and eternal. Was Luffy one of them? Was Zoro? Could humans really be so consistent and solid in their ways that you could have complete faith in them to never betray you? The more she thought back on their journey so far, from that small detour to Shell's town all the way to Alabasta, the more she wanted to say yes. But her mind kept coming back to one inescapable fact that continued to draw ever closer to her line of sight. Luffy and Zoro were hiding something. It begged the question, what didn't they want the rest of the crew to know, and why? Whatever it was, it seemed they were willing to tell Ace. Whatever conversation they were going to have when they arrived at the ship, she and Usopp were apparently not going to be a part of it, which annoyed her to no end. Was he simply on a need-to-know basis, whereas the rest of them weren't? Or did Luffy not trust them as much as he trusted his brother? Nami's eyebrows furrowed. No, that wasn't right. Luffy's trust in her had never wavered even when her loyalty was questionable at best. If anything, he was too trusting. Did she even have a right to question him for not telling her some things? Nami sighed. She was being a hypocrite, no doubt about it. When they got back to the Going Merry, Zoro led Ace to the training room where they could speak in private. Luffy turned to Nami and Usopp and rubbed his head rather guiltily. I'm sorry about this guys, he began. It's just, there are some things he trailed off, not really knowing how to put it. Surprisingly, Usopp flashed a smile and gave him a thumbs up. No worries Luffy. If this is something between you and your brother, the great Captain Usopp will respect your privacy along with the rest of the crew. He nudged their navigator. Right Nami? Nami crossed her arms and pouted for a split second before nodding, which caused Luffy to smile gratefully. Luffy, it's fine if you're not ready to tell us everything. I know I'm not really one to talk in that regard, she said. But just never feel like you can't tell us something because of how we'll react, okay? Whether because Luffy was surprised at her sudden change in demeanor or because she was spot on, her words seemed to strike a nerve in her captain, whose eyes widened suddenly before he averted his gaze. I'll keep that in mind, he said, before jumping up to the higher floor of the ship and following his brother and first mate inside. He found Ace waiting patiently, twirling one of Zoro's weights in his hand. So where should we start? Zoro asked in a serious tone. Well, you can stop trying to hide your strength for starters, Ace suggested. I already have an idea of how strong you are anyway. He ended up eating his words when Luffy and Zoro both stopped suppressing their auras, causing his eyes to widen and almost causing him to drop the weight in his hand. Luckily, he caught it. What? How? Why? I have so many questions. Well, start with whichever one you want Ace, Luffy said in an amused tone. What the hell is going on? Well that's comprehensive, Zoro said with a snort, causing Ace to glare at him. This makes no sense, Ace said, rubbing his temples. You two just arrived in paradise and you both feel stronger than most New World pirate captains. Where did you even learn to use haki? There's next to no one in East Blue who can use it and no pirate in the first half who can use it as well you've shown. Where we learned is kind of a long story, Luffy said. But let's just say we both had very good teachers. As to why we're so good at it, it's because we've been to the New World. Ace looked up at Luffy in surprise. What? Even if you had miraculously survived a trip like that, there's no way you could have made it without anyone noticing. Especially Gramps. When could you have? It was over 2 years from now, Luffy said, answering his question before he could finish. Ace stared at Luffy for a full 10 seconds, as if trying to figure out if he was being played. Then. "Oh hell no," he said, finally speaking up. "You did not just talk about a future event like it already happened. Luffy, I know you. You suck at lying. You have no talent for it. You can hide the truth, you can refuse to talk, hell, you can even keep quiet as a determined psychopath punches you in the face with spiked gauntlets, but you can't lie. Still, if you're serious about what you're implying that we're from the future," Luffy confirmed, cutting off his rant. Ace groaned and threw his hands up in the air in exasperation. "Oh sure, you're from the future. Yay, and I'm a park ranger." He sighed and relented. "How did you do it? And why?" he asked finally. Zoro was the one who answered. "As to how, let's just say we made it to Raftel and leave it at that." Ace gave that some thought before shrugging and nodding, and Zoro continued. "As to why, there are some things that we want to prevent from happening." "So in other words, you're playing God," Ace clarified. "Call it what you want," Zoro replied. "We don't really care about the ethics of it." Ace turned to Luffy and raised an eyebrow, but his brother just shrugged in agreement. "Alright Luffy, I get that we're not saints, but you're meddling with time here. Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Ace asked. "At the time, I wasn't really sure at all to be honest," Luffy admitted. "I just knew that I had nothing left to lose." That comment made Ace wince. It wasn't something he wanted to hear. "Was it that bad?" he asked. Zoro nodded gravely. "What happened?" Neither of them answered. As he looked back and forth between the two, he took note of their behavior. They both had their fists clenched and were looking down at the floor in guilt. As he tried to wrap his mind around that, he noticed something that shocked him. Luffy was trembling. A sudden realization hit Ace. "There's a reason why you're telling me all this." The second he said that, Luffy looked back up at him. Only Ace was no longer looking at Luffy. He was looking at a ghost, one whose expression rightfully haunted the flame man to his very core. This couldn't be Luffy. He was too old, too scarred. The happy-go-lucky 14-year-old that Ace had left behind at Dawn Island, this wasn't him. And yet, in a way that Ace couldn't explain or describe, it was. "Ace, it's been so long," he said quietly. Ace took a few seconds to gather his thoughts before responding. "I died." It wasn't a question, but Zoro nodded anyway. "And you flipped the world onto a different axis just to save me?" he asked with narrowed eyes. This elicited a dry chuckle from Luffy. "No Ace. That was just the beginning. It all started with your duel with Blackbeard," Zoro stated. Ace stilled. "So I got done in by Teach?" he asked. Zoro thought he detected a hint of annoyance in his voice. "No, worse. He handed you over to the world government," Luffy replied, causing Ace's eyes to widen in recognition. "If he did that?" Zoro completed the thought for him. "Whitebeard wouldn't let them execute you without a fight, but the world government was determined to do it, even if it meant." Ace covered his face with his hand. Luffy and Zoro gave him a minute to collect his thoughts. He finally spoke again. "So where do we go from here?" "That's the part you're not going to like," Luffy said. "Whatever you do, you can't confront Blackbeard. Not yet. In our timeline he became a huge problem, but if we can prevent the war of the best, he'll lose his chance to gain the power he's looking for. You should know that he already got the Yami Yami no Mi from Thatch, and he's already someone to be careful of." "Yeah, I'll bet," Ace scoffed. "If he took me down, he's a force to be reckoned with." He thought for a moment, then sighed. "You're right Luffy, I don't like it. The old man warned me not to go after the bastard, but I was determined. I still am. But if going after him is going to bring my own crew to ruin, then I'll hold off on it for now. At least until I'm sure I can beat him." Luffy's shoulders slumped in relief. The first big step had been taken to shaping a better future. The Whitebeard War had changed a lot, and not for the better. He would still have to pay close attention to make sure it didn't happen though. He couldn't account for all the factors after all. "Is there anything else you think I should know?" Ace asked. "Well yeah actually," Luffy replied. "Sabo is alive." Ace didn't think he could ever sympathize with Nami more than he did at that moment. "Eyes, what the hell are we doing here? I can't believe we're here right now. He's going to kill us. We're so dead." "What? I don't want to die." "Shut up you idiots." The two complaining voices were silenced by the third, but their defeated expressions conveyed what they thought of the current situation perfectly fine. "Mr. 3, a fourth voice spoke up, they have a point. What makes you think the boss will spare us? Shouldn't we get far away from here?" "You're talking a lot more now that our lives are on the line, aren't you, Miss Goldenweek? And I already told you, it doesn't matter where we go. He'll find us. Our only choice is to ask for a second opportunity to get rid of the Strawats." "Hey, isn't that jumping the gun a bit?" asked Mr. 5. "Even assuming that he'd give us a second chance, he hasn't contacted us since he gave you those orders. That means he probably thinks you're dead. We could escape right now and he'd never know we survived." No, he'd find out, Mr. 3 said somberly. Don't underestimate the boss's ability to gather information. Especially when he has Miss All Sunday working for him. He won't leave any loose ends. This is crazy, Miss Valentine said. You're just going to walk up to him and say sorry I failed the mission, let me try again. This is Mr. Zero we're talking about. I didn't ask for your opinion. Mr. 3 hissed. If you want to run, go ahead. I never ask you to come with me anyway. Miss Valentine gulped. She knew he had a point, but she also knew their chances of evasion, and by extension survival, were quite a bit higher with Mr. 3 with them. That's what I thought. Now let's get going. The more time we spend here, the more time we give the Strawats to arrive in Alabasta. If they interfere with Mr. Zero's plans, we'll never escape his wrath. On cue, the 4 undercover agents scurried down an alley towards the center of Nanohana. Are we getting close, Chopper? VV asked in mid-run. Yes, the human reindeer confirmed. The scent of gunpowder is getting stronger. I'm certain there's a high concentration of it up ahead. VV nodded as she panted heavily. They had completely left Nanohana and were now in the neighboring oasis town of Katoria, to the east. VV was surprised Chopper's nose had picked up whatever scent they were following. Hey VV-chan, the rebel army would be trying to stay hidden right? Sanji asked. Yes, that's right. So they'll probably have guards on the lookout won't they? Yes. Why do you ask? Because I just found some of that gunpowder. You too. Stay right where you are. A voice spoke up from above them. VV and Chopper looked up to find a man on a nearby rooftop aiming a rifle at them. Sanji was not so coincidentally standing in between the man and VV, whose eyes widened in recognition. Kibi? She practically shouted. This caused the man to temporarily lose his rigid demeanor, but he quickly composed himself. How do you know me? Identify yourself. VV removed the white hood from her head, and this time the man's eyes widened. He immediately lowered his weapon. VV. VV was smiling in relief. She never thought she'd run into another member of the Sunasuna clan. Well, other than Koza. This made things much easier. VV, what in the world is going on? You've been missing for over 2 years and now I find you sneaking around in an alleyway. What happened? There's a reason I've been missing. I've been acquiring information and it's crucial that I give it to Koza. He is here isn't he? Could you please take me to him? VV considered this for a moment. VV was the daughter of the man they were most likely going to war with soon. But she was also one of them. They had long since thought her dead, but if she was alive, then he was sure they could trust her. She had nothing to do with the origins of the Civil War to begin with. Come with me, he said, before quickly jumping off the roof and leading them through the streets. They finally came to a run-down building in a less crowded district of Katoria. Kibi knocked 6 times on the door and they were let in. Koza-san, you're not going to believe who I stumbled across. Who is it? Came a voice beyond the wall, one that instantly caused VV to inhale sharply. She decided to forego all formalities and ran into the room where the voice had originated from. Koza sat up in the bed in shock, his eyes glued to the new arrival. VV how? Koza, I know this is sudden after all this time, but you have to put an end to this civil war. You're being manipulated. My father wasn't the one behind the Alabasta's ruin. Whoa, VV, slow down alright. Just start by telling me where you've been all this time. VV took a deep breath. I've been in hiding so that I could find out who was really responsible for the current state of affairs in this country. The one behind the civil war, the one who really stole the reign. He's the leader of a criminal organization that's been working in Alabasta from the shadows. 2 years ago, I infiltrated the organization to gather information and find out who the leader was. You what? Koza asked in shock. I went undercover as a member of Baroque Works so that I could find out what their motive was from the inside, VV said impatiently, wanting to get to the point. VV, how could you do something that reckless? You could have been killed. VV was taken aback by the audacity of his question. She gritted her teeth, and you're any better? Here you are, about to lead our country into a civil war, tear it to ruins, and play right into his hands, and you have the gall to tell me I was being reckless. Koza was pale. What do you mean I'm playing into his hands? His goal is to seize the Alabastian throne. That's why he framed my father and planted the dance powder in his palace. His organization has been behind everything so far, and the war will give them the perfect opportunity to take control of the country during the chaos. Koza was silent for a moment. Who is he? The leader? He finally asked. VV sighed in relief. Now they were getting somewhere. Crocodile of the 7 warlords, she replied. Koza's eyes widened. This country's hero is the one leading it to ruin. He's no hero, VV spat. He just knows how to keep up a good public image. He knows that not even my father will suspect him if he pretends to have Alabasta's interests at heart. This is a lot to take in, VV, Koza said, rubbing a hand over tired eyes. I know, but you have to believe me. If you don't call off the rebel army. I believe you, he said quickly. It's just that I can't tell them what you've just told me and expect them to believe me. But we haven't made a move yet, so there's still time. Does your father know about this? No, but I can send a message to him, Vivi replied. Good. Tell him everything you just told me. I'll send a request to the Royal Army to meet with King Cobra for negotiations. We'll make an announcement to the public that we're signing a treaty. That should throw a wrench in Crocodile's plans. Until then, he turned to Kibi. Nothing leaves this room. Kibi nodded. Vivi let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Thank you, she whispered. Koza was silent again before speaking. I'm sorry, Vivi. For everything. Vivi leaned forward and hugged him. It doesn't matter, she said. All that matters is that we can fix this and prevent the bloodshed. What will you be doing in the meantime? Koza asked. I'll be keeping an eye on Baroque works. Actually, I was brought here by the Strawat pirates. Without them, I wouldn't have even made it this far. But with their help, I have faith that we can put an end to Crocodile's plans. Koza raised an eyebrow. I'll take your word for it. But be careful, Vivi. Vivi smiled. I will. She exited the room to meet Sanji and Chopper, and Koza followed after them. During the entire encounter, no one looked towards a certain dark corner of the dimly lit room. If they had, they would have noticed a lone crystal blue eye on the wall, watching them from the shadows before it blinked out of existence. I'd beard about his situation, but no one else. They could only imagine the headache it would cause if word reached the wrong people, so for now, it was on a need-to-know basis. Well then, until we meet again, Luffy, said as he hopped off the ship and into his devil fruit-operated boat. See you at the top. As sped off, Nami's mind finally caught up with her. We're allies with the Whitebeard pirates, she mumbled. So, said Zoro with a smirk. That's insane. Exclaimed Usopp. We must be the only allies they have in this part of the Grand Line. Are we, like, really important now? You're the crew of the future pirate king Usopp, Luffy said confidently. We're already important. He turned to Vivi. So did you guys find any leads on the rebel army? Vivi gasped. After the excitement with Luffy's brother, she almost forgot to tell them about what happened. As she explained that she had met up with Koza and that he would be conducting negotiations with her father, Luffy and Zoro listened impassively. When she finished, Luffy just nodded. Sounds like it went smoothly then, Zoro said. I guess our next stop is Alabasta. We can supervise everything from there. Vivi nodded eagerly. She could hardly believe it. They had come so far and finally, they were making progress. She quickly tied a note for her father to Karu and instructed him to deliver it to him. As Karu made his way across the desert, Sanji's voice came from inside the kitchen. Lunch is ready. As the Strawats filed into the ship, Luffy and Zoro stayed outside. Luffy spoke up. It won't be this easy, will it? He asked. Zoro grunted. No, it won't. Especially not while Robin's working with Crocodile. Luffy pouted. We should have just recruited her back in Sake Summit. Whiskey Peak. And I don't think that would have worked too well, Zoro said, causing Luffy to pout more. I know. But it's really weird to have her as an enemy. Not to mention annoying, he thought for a moment. What do you think Croc's next move will be? I'm not sure. But I wouldn't put anything past him. Luffy's thought process was suddenly interrupted by the growl of his stomach and the two went inside to eat with the rest of the crew. After lunch, the Strawats set sail to the north up the Sandora River. Their plan was to drop anchor closer to Alabasta, as Vivi had suggested, before they crossed the desert on foot. In an underwater structure located in the center of Rain Base, Sir Crocodile of the 7 Royal Warlords sat in a comfortable-looking chair. You wouldn't be able to tell, however, from the infuriated scowl on his face as he stared at the transponder snail across from him. You're sure about this? He asked in a deceptively calm voice. Of course. I had a hunch to begin with, but I've just confirmed it for myself, said a melodic voice on the other end of the line. Crocodile was silent for a moment. Very well, he finally said. I suppose I'll excuse your absence from the meeting if you don't make it in time, seeing as it would have been a minor setback had I not gotten this information. You're ever so kind, Mr. Zero, the voice said. Crocodile grunted. So then what are you planning to do about this? That's for me to know, he said in annoyance. But of course. I suppose it wouldn't be my place to know if it happened to have something to do with a certain crossdresser. Goodbye, Miss All Sunday, Crocodile said before hanging up. He looked at the clock. 3 p.m. The number agents would be meeting at Spider Cafe in a couple hours. Minus Mr. 3 of course. That coward was no doubt on the other side of the Grand Line by now. It suddenly made sense why he hadn't been in contact since his report. The report had been false. To think he would fail his mission, give a false report and then run with his tail between his legs. Crocodile hadn't thought highly of him to begin with, but he definitely hadn't expected this. No matter. He'd find him once Operation Utopia was over. 5 p.m. coast across from Alabasta. What is this thing? A turtle? Or a seal? Usopp asked as he stared down at what appeared to a seal in a turtle shell. Vivi's eyes widened. That's a Kung Fu Dugong, she exclaimed. The Kung Fu do what now? Usopp asked as he got into what he presumed to be a Kung Fu stance. No wait. It'll take that as Vivi flinched as the Dugong beat the crap out of Usopp in 3 seconds flat. Challenge, she finished. As it stood with its arms raised over its head in a universal sign of victory, Vivi closed her eyes and sighed, completely missing what happened next. Looks like we've got a winner over here, Nami commented as Luffy stood over the creature, posing in a manner that was very much similar to what the small sea mammal had previously been doing. No, that's even worse. Vivi objected. The Kung Fu Dugong suddenly got up and bowed to Luffy. It's their custom to become the victor's disciple. Quite abruptly, the shore became filled with a swarm of Kung Fu Dugongs who were all seemingly intrigued by one of their own losing a fight. One briefly communicated with the original Dugong before they all looked up at Luffy with stars in their eyes. Luffy raised both eyebrows. I think I can only take one disciple right now. Sorry. Who says you're taking any to begin with? Nami raged. The Kung Fu Dugongs evidently took his words as a challenge, however, and all charged at him. In seconds, they were all defeated and bowing to Luffy respectfully. Did this happen last time? Zoro wondered. Seems familiar. See? That's why I said I can only take one, Luffy told them. We can't bring all of you along. The Dugongs sulked as Nami, Vivi, Usopp, and Chopper listened in shock. He's actually going to bring one along. After a quick group lesson that Luffy was persuaded into, as well as a tearful goodbye, the Straw Hats set out across the desert on foot along with their new companion. So, you got a name? Luffy asked as he walked alongside the Dugong that he had beaten first. He shook his head in a surprising display of comprehension. Okay then I guess I'll call you Seal. What kind of name is that? Nami mumbled. Seal on the other hand, nodded enthusiastically, indicating that he was content with the name. Not to trample on your random and spontaneous decision-making Luffy, Zoro began, but can this thing even cross the desert? Good question, Luffy said, before turning to Seal. Can you? Seal nodding enthusiastically again, making punching motions with his arms that seemed to say I'm tougher than you think. Kung Fu Dugongs are sea mammals, but they're also fit to survive in desert climates due to their surroundings environment, Vivi said. He'll need to go back to the sea eventually, but he'll be fine for now. Luffy, satisfied with the knowledge, proceeded to drill Seal on various punches and blocks, as well as when to use them, as they continued their journey to Alabasta. Stop walking around. Mr. 2 yelled as he stood up in annoyance. How long are they gonna make us wait? They could at least give us some food in the meantime. I need hors d'oeuvres. Hors d'oeuvres. Mr. 2, could you please sit down and wait quietly? Miss Doublefinger asked in a tone of false politeness. No way. I'm gonna spin until they get here. Quit yapping too. You're making my hips ache. Miss Merry Christmas snapped. Mr. 4 started to say something as well, but it was slow to the point of being incoherent, so no one paid him any mind. Mr. 1 simply at the corner of the table, ignoring them all. But as Mr. 2 kept spinning, he grew increasingly annoyed. You'd best sit down before I disembowel you, he said quietly. Mr. 2 turned toward him. This guy again. Was that a threat? Didn't it sound like one? I thought I was pretty clear, Mr. 1 said in a bored tone. I think it's pretty clear that Mr. 0 will disembowel you both if he catches you screwing around in here, Miss Doublefinger commented. Surprisingly, this pacified both of them, and Mr. 2 sat down with a pout. About 10 seconds passed before. Stop walking around. Where are they? Mr. 1 was thinking about a more painful way to kill someone than disembowelment when his partner in crime spoke up again. You know, he has a point, she said. I wouldn't know what to expect from Mr. 0, but Miss All Sunday is usually pretty punctual. On top of that, the Mr. 3 and Mr. 5 pair never showed up either. I can't help but feel that we're out of the loop. I'm afraid none of them will be able to make it, said a deep voice from the end of the table. They all turned to the chair where the voice originated from in shock, none of them having noticed his arrival. Mr. 1's eyes narrowed. When did he? The situation arose, and Miss All Sunday went to take care of it, the voice said. Unfortunately, she won't make it back in time for the meeting. As for the other 4, I'd advise you not to mention their names again. But no matter, the time is near. He turned around in his chair, revealing his face. For your final mission, Operation Utopia. The officer agent stared in shock. Mr. 2's jaw dropped. Crocodile. Oh good, so you know me, the man said smugly. Of course we know you, you're one of the 7 warlords. Miss Doublefinger exclaimed. But why would you be? You're our boss. Mr. 1 said, more in surprise than disappointment. So we were following the orders of a government-sanctioned pirate all along, Mr. Two exclaimed. Any objections? Crocodile asked menacingly, immediately silencing them all. None here, Miss Doublefinger stated, sweating a bit. I'm just confused as to why a royal warlord would go out of his way to form a criminal organization. What I desire isn't wealth or fame, Crocodile replied. It's power. The officer agents listened intently. Seeing that he had their attention, Crocodile smirked. Allow me to explain the real reason behind the formation of Baroque works. My true objective. A few minutes later, after they all read over their mission orders, Mr. Two's brow furrowed. So I have a separate mission, huh? That's correct, Crocodile confirmed. Miss All Sunday was acting as a spy and was able to uncover that Princess Vivi and the Strawats have met with the leader of the rebellion. As aggravating as it is, he now knows of our plan, which complicates matters. That's where you come in, Mr. Two. The number agents, who were all high up enough to know about Mr. Two's ability, all widened their eyes in comprehension. The rest of you, Crocodile continued, are to come with me to Alabasta during the start of the operation to deal with any pestilence. Until then, Mr. Two, your role is key. Alright. You can count on me, boss. Very well then. You're to leave. Mr. Two was already rushing out the back door, doing spins the whole way. Immediately, Crocodile finished, sweat dropping. It's about time, Miss Doublefinger muttered. Mr. One grunted in agreement. How unexpected. I never imagined that you of all people would be Mr. Zero. The number agents, Crocodile included, all turned to the source of the voice. While most of them were surprised to see Mr. Three, seeing as he hadn't shown up at Spider's cafe, Crocodile's eyes just narrowed in anger. Mr. Three. You have some nerve showing your face here. Mr. Three said nothing under the heat of his glare as he continued walking forward, thinking about the events that had led him to come here alone. 5 p.m., Spider's cafe. There it is. The rendezvous point, Mr. Three said quietly as he observed who he assumed to be Mr. One calmly walk toward Spider's cafe from a distance. He was concealed under a wax dome that was painted to be the color of a rock by Miss Goldenweek. Mr. Two and the Mr. Four pair had already arrived, so the only one missing was strangely Miss Doublefinger, who should have arrived with Mr. One. Not that it mattered. Okay, the plan is simple. Once they begin their journey to meet Mr. Zero, we follow behind them discreetly. With any luck, they'll lead us right to the boss. This plan is doomed to fail. Miss Valentine hissed from behind him. The woman was in obvious distress along with Mr. Five. She's right. Her partner agent agreed. There's no way we can be that stealthy as a group of four, and even if we somehow make it to the meeting place, the chances of Mr. Zero forgiving us are slim to none. At worst, we get killed by the Mr. One pair. At best, we get killed by the boss. Mr. Five paused to let that information sink in. Mr. Three said nothing, so he continued. Listen, it isn't too late to turn back now. Even if he sends Mr. One to track us down, our chances of survival will still be much higher than if we walk into his base of operations and offer ourselves to him on a silver platter. Miss Goldenweek was silent as she listened to the exchange. To be honest, she agreed with Mr. Five's logic. Mr. Three was being unreasonable. Irrational, almost. He was always the best at calculating their chances for success on a mission. Out of all of them, he should have been the one to come to that conclusion first. That could only mean one thing. Survival isn't your only goal here, is it? She suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Mr. Five and Miss Valentine looked at her in confusion. What are you? Mr. Five started to ask before his eyes widened under his sunglasses and he turned back to Mr. Three. Are you serious? He asked numbly. His superior didn't even acknowledge the question or turn to face him for that matter. You want to finish the mission, Miss Valentine whispered in horror. So what if I do? Mr. Three finally answered in an annoyed tone. You've got to be shitting me. Mr. Five almost shouted. He was having trouble keeping his voice under control now. We all saw how strong Strawat was. He wiped the floor with us all. Even if by some miracle you got your mission clearance, there's no way you can kill that guy. You'd risk all of us dying for the sake of your pride. Why would you risk your life for the damn mission? It's the only thing I would risk my life for. Mr. Three snapped, effectively shutting him up. He turned around and matched Mr. Five's glare. I already told you guys that you don't have to come. You just followed me of your own accord. If all you're going to do is complain, then why are you still here? What am I, your babysitter? If you want to go, then go. You'll only slow me down anyway. Mr. Five was silent for a moment. Then, he got up. Let's go, Miss Valentine, he said. His partner agent didn't hesitate for more than a second before she rose to her feet as well. She shot Miss Goldenweek an apologetic glance. We're slowing you down. It's ironic that you'd say that, Mr. Five said. I know you're not really that blind to the situation. The only one here in danger of being chased across the Grand Line, he turned back to the wax man in apathy. is you, Mr. 3. Miss Valentine may be officer agents, but we're not high up enough to be a threat to the organization if left alive. Neither is Miss Gildenweek for that matter. Even if she's your partner, she's not privy to most of the secrets that you've been privileged with. The three of us aren't worth the resources and time it would take to track us down. As long as we're with you, on the other hand, he trailed off as Mr. 3 narrowed his eyes. Do you know why we came with you? Mr. 5 asked suddenly. It's because Miss Gildenweek asked us to. We were simply respecting the wishes of our fellow agent and superior. One that we actually like, I might add. This news finally evoked a reaction from Mr. 3, whose eyes widened as he turned to the girl in question. She averted her eyes from him, staring at the ground. No matter. We're leaving while we still have the chance, Mr. 5 concluded. I suggest you do the same, Miss Gildenweek. With that, he and Miss Valentine left the dome and headed back the way they had come. Mr. 3 gritted his teeth. Go with them, he said to his partner agent. Her eyes widened. He's right. You're not the one in danger, he continued. This is my problem. So get the hell out of here. His voice was almost bitter. Miss Gildenweek didn't move. But I. Treat that as an order. Her eyes glistened as she slowly got up and reluctantly left the dome as well. She turned back toward him on her way out. Good luck, she mumbled, before turning away and following behind the Mr. 5 pair. Mr. 3 was jolted out of his thoughts by the voice of Miss Doublefinger. How did you even find this place? The officer agent asked. We didn't even know where we were being taken until we arrived. I was tailing you all since Spider's Cafe. I hid in the back of the carriage, Mr. 3 explained, snapping back to reality. How clever of you, Crocodile said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Now would you kindly explain why you're here and why I should refrain from gutting you? I came to request a second chance on my mission, Mr. 3 stated. A second chance? Crocodile repeated. What do you take me for? I always assumed you were content with my zero-tolerance policy for failure. Now that you've failed a mission for the first time, you expect to receive special treatment. It isn't that, Mr. 3 said quickly. It's just that considering the circumstances. The circumstances aren't going to help you here, said Crocodile, his voice raising a little. If you were going to come here groveling for forgiveness, then you shouldn't have given me that goddamned false mission report. If there's one thing I hate more than a failure, it's a coward. Mr. 3's eyes widened in shock and confusion. False mission report. I'm afraid I don't know what you're. Stop making a jackass of yourself, Crocodile spoke in a low tone, standing up from his chair. If the growing tension wasn't enough to make the rest of the number agents flinch, this single action was. Only Mr. 1 seemed to be keeping his cool through the encounter. You reported that you killed the Strawwats in Princess VV in Little Garden. Because you lied to cover your own ass, the Strawwats were able to meet with the rebel army. He began walking toward the stuttering wax man. Now you have 10 seconds to enlighten me on why I should continue to humor your little request. Why you must be mistaken. I didn't even use my transponder snail once on Little Garden. I didn't give any report. Mr. 3 defended. Crocodile froze mid-step, his eyes narrowed. He continued to stare at Mr. 3, as if searching his face for any sign of deception, an act that unnerved the wax man to no end. Eventually, his scowl lightened and then disappeared, replaced by a chilling smile. Wait, what? Mr. 3 rubbed his eyes to make sure he was seeing right as Crocodile burst into laughter. Clever bastard, the Sandman muttered. I'll kill you, make no mistake. It barely registered in Mr. 3's mind that Crocodile wasn't even talking to him anymore before he was yanked off the ground by a disembodied hand. In any other situation, he would have had enough clarity of mind to notice the sand trailing behind the lone appendage. As it was, he was busy gasping for air as he was suspended by his neck. A series of emotions flashed through Mr. 3's mind at that moment as he began to feel his throat drying up. They ranged from panic to despair to resigned acceptance and quickly succeeded each other. But there was something else mixed in there as well. Regret. Not regret that he was dying. That he had expected to an extent. But his mind kept flashing back to that conversation outside Spider's Cafe. He had already known that his 3 fellow agents could have left without him. That's why he had kept subtly telling them to stop following him. But to find out that they all realized it as well. It meant that they hadn't just been following him out of a need for survival. They had been following him out of loyalty. At the very least, his own partner had. No one had ever extended that type of courtesy to him before. And he had spit in their faces. No matter how much he kept denying it, that was bothering him. So it wasn't so much that his time had come that made him feel this regret. It was that his time had come and he was so purely, hopelessly alone in the world, just as he always had been. Shrivel up and dry, Crocodile said with a sinister grin on his face. Stop. A new voice yelled. Crocodile turned his head in surprise to see none other than Miss Gildenweek standing in the doorway. His eyes narrowed and he quickly dispersed into sand to avoid the circle of paint that was splattered at his feet a split second afterwards, dropping Mr. 3 unceremoniously to the floor. His body reformed a few feet away and his countenance conveyed unspoken promises of murder. It wasn't long before Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine came running into the room. "So, you all want to join him?" Crocodile asked menacingly. "Leave some for me, Mr. 0. I was getting bored," Mr. 1 said as he walked towards the lower rank agents, Miss Doublefinger following behind him. Crocodile scowled. "Kill each other for all I care." He was in a fairly bad mood right now and his venomous tone was indiscriminate. Mr. 1 smirked. "I myself don't feel like dying." Mr. 3 watched the scene unfold in shock. He had never really counted on the slim probability of receiving a second chance to kill the Strawwats. He was fully prepared to die here. He never expected that his fellow agents would come after him, especially after their previous fallout. So why? Why did they come back? He didn't have much time to think about it as Mr. 1's arm morphed into a blade before his eyes. "Supa Supa no Mi." Mr. 3 immediately recognized in horror. He instinctively formed a wall of wax in between the blademan and his partner, sparing her the fate of being pierced between the eyes. Mr. 1 scoffed in annoyance. He turned toward Mr. 3 but was interrupted as Mr. 5 charged towards him. His explosive fist met Mr. 1 dead on and the blademan was sent hurtling back by the force of the blow. He quickly righted himself, however. The lower officer agents were horrified to see that there wasn't a scratch on him. He almost looked bored. "They're lining up to die," he commented as he walked back towards them. Miss Gildenweek started to wave her brush again but was interrupted by Miss Doublefinger. She was caught off guard by the woman's ability and yelled in pain as her hand was impaled by a spike that stemmed from the higher agent's finger. She dropped her brush to the floor. "You have quite the troublesome ability, if I remember correctly," Miss Doublefinger drawled as she retracted the spike. She prepared to drive another spike through the girl's head but was blocked by a candle wall. Another one simultaneously sprung up in between Mr. 1 and Mr. 5, who was also saved the fate of being impaled by the durable material. Mr. 1 grunted as his steel arms rebounded off the wax. Miss Valentine made the next move, jumping high above Miss Doublefinger's speed and maximizing her weight. In a surprising show of reflexes, the spike woman leapt out of the way as her assailant came crashing down. "Neat trick," she commented as she walked up to the crater her adversary had made. "But it does leave you ever so vulnerable." In a split second, Miss Valentine's abdomen was pierced through by a spike that grew from Miss Doublefinger's heel. She screamed in pain as her blood leaked onto the floor she was brutally pinned to. Mr. 5 lost his head and ran at Miss Doublefinger, but Mr. 1 was right behind him. Mr. 3 was forced to divide his focus as he attempted to separate Miss Doublefinger from Miss Valentine and shield Mr. 5 from Mr. 1. While he succeeded in the former, Mr. 1 anticipated the latter and slashed across Mr. 5's back regardless. The bowman groaned and fell to the floor. After only a minute, Mr. 3 was the only one in shape to continue fighting. As Mr. 1 and Miss Doublefinger turned their attention to him, he quickly created more wax. Handle lock. The quickly hardening wad of wax was fairly easily dodged by both agents, who both ran in to gut him. Not knowing what else to do, Mr. 3 surrounded himself with wax. Bladed and spiked arms met the steel-like substance head-on, but barely left a scratch. While Miss Doublefinger was beyond annoyed, Mr. 1 gave War a frightening grin. "I think you overestimate the power of that wax of yours, Mr. 3, the blademan said. Suddenly, Mr. 3 could hear what sounded like a buzzsaw coming from the other side of the wall he made. Soon afterward, he felt an incredible force collide with it and was horrified to realize that his wall was being shaved away. He was slowly losing ground to the spinning blades on Mr. 1's arms. Miss Doublefinger smiled. Well, while you're busy with that, I suppose I should finish off the rest of them," she said as she walked toward the other 3 defecting agents. No longer in a shape to defend themselves, they could only watch as spikes grew out of all of her fingers. "Wait." Mr. 1 and Miss Doublefinger both halted what they were doing as they heard the voice of Crocodile. They looked back towards him and noted with some annoyance that Mr. 4 and Miss Merry Christmas were sitting back and enjoying the show. Crocodile grinned menacingly. "I have a better idea." Koza frowned as he looked outside the carriage. They were on their way to Alabasta, but they seemed to be straying off course a little. Was it just his imagination? Deciding to ignore it for now, he pulled his head back inside and faced Kibi. "You're nervous," his follower commented lightly. Koza sighed. "How could I not be? What is he going to think of me? If VV is right about his innocence, how can I face him? Whether or not it's difficult, you're the leader of the rebellion," Kibi said sensibly. "It has to be you. It would be an even greater insult if you sent someone in your place." "Don't you think I know that?" Koza muttered irritably. Kibi was silent for a while. "Something else is bothering you," he said. "Damn it," Koza thought. That's what happens when your right-hand man is also your childhood friend. Kibi read him way too easily. I just have a bad feeling, he admitted. Like we should have announced the ceasefire to the rest of the army. You know what would happen if we did that, Kibi argued. They would want an explanation, and if we released intel like that, it could reach Crocodile. That man has already manipulated us as if we were puppets tangled in strings. We can't risk it. We have to at least wait until after the negotiations, so the leaders of both sides can come to an understanding. Yeah, you're right, Koza said reluctantly. Suddenly, the carriage stopped. Koza and Kibi looked confused for a moment before they both climbed out to meet the steer, who had also gotten out. Hey, what are we doing here? Kibi asked, looking around. Would you stop in the middle of the desert? The soldier kept a blank face. I was ordered to, he stated. Kibi raised an eyebrow and looked at Koza, who had his eyes narrowed suspiciously. I never gave you an order like that. The soldier smirked, causing both of the men's eyes to widen. No, you didn't, he said as he raised his rifle. Koza reacted immediately, raising his leg and kicking the gun barrel to the side in one swift motion. The unloyal soldier looked surprised as the shot fired off to the side. As he tried to aim the gun back towards them, Kibi rammed into him with his shoulder, knocking him off his feet. He proceeded to kick the gun out of his hands. The soldier gritted his teeth and tried to lift himself up, only to be roundhouse kicked across the face by Koza, who then kicked the gun up into the air and caught it, aiming it directly at his assailant. Who are you working for? He growled. The soldier just smirked again. I don't know. But he's far more intimidating than you. Don't screw with me. Koza shouted. Who is it? Is it that damn warlord? Surprisingly, this elicited a reaction from the man, whose brows furrowed. Warlord? He asked in confusion. Don't try to deny it, Kibi said. We have intel that states he's your leader. The soldier suddenly started sweating heavily, and not from the desert heat, as his expression morphed into one of overt fear. And judging from the look on your face, I'd say we're right. Hey, stop. You don't know what you're talking about. The man shouted. Koza wondered why he was just now showing fear when he had been unfazed with a gun pointed at him point blank. I think we do, Kibi said, now the one smirking. The royal warlord, Sir Crow. Shut up. The man suddenly tried to lunge at Kibi. Koza grimaced but didn't hesitate as he shot the man directly in the head. He was dead even before he slumped back against the sand. Kibi rubbed his eyes. Just what was the point of all this? He asked as he raised his arms and gestured to the barren desert around them. Does he think we're stranded? That neither of us can drive a damn carriage through our home country? Look at the tattoo on his arm, Koza said, ignoring the rant. Kibi knelt down and looked it over, frowning. What is that? The mark of their organization? He asked. Perhaps. But regardless of what it is, we need to keep an eye out for it. From now on, anyone in the rebel army who is seen with this mark is to be brought in for questioning. Kibi nodded as they both stood up and started towards the carriage. Koza froze, however, as he caught sight of something, or rather someone, out in the distance. It looked like a ballerina. I'm gonna die, Usopp said miserably, his sentence made choppy by endless pants. Not for me, Chopper replied unenergetically as Zoro pulled him across the desert sand on a sled. The reindeer-human hybrid had been reduced to a semi-conscious, sizzling ball of fur. Being better suited to colder climates, he could barely walk in the desert heat. At least Chopper has an excuse, Sanji grumbled. You're just being melodramatic, Usopp. Hey, I sure as hell do have an excuse. Usopp argued. I've suddenly come down with I can't walk through the desert anymore, hiatus. There's no disease like that, Chopper stated matter-of-factly. Sanji smirked. You heard the doctor, long nose. Keep walking. Usopp's jaw dropped. Chopper, you traitor. As if to make his case more convincing, Usopp suddenly collapsed backwards onto the sand, making unconvincing wheezing noises. I can't go on, he groaned, raising his hand toward the hazy sky. Zoro sighed in annoyance and walked back to him. Don't make me carry you too. Come on, do you want to fall behind? I won't make it. Go on without me, Zoro. If you say so, Zoro said with a shrug, before leaving him there in the sand and catching up with the rest of the crew. Usopp suddenly bolted up onto his feet and ran after them. Hey, wait. Don't leave me. Zuru. Will you calm down, you idiot? Nami reprimanded. All you're doing is wasting energy that you should be using to walk. Keep it up and you're just going to need more water, and that's something we can't spare right now. Sanji had to agree. Most of them weren't faring very well with the sun beating down on them. Chopper was immobile, Nami refused to let him carry her, saying he wasn't to be trusted, which was probably true, some part of his mind supplied. Usopp was well, he was Usopp, and he himself was sweating heavily. Zoro was toughing it out, but Sanji could tell even he was at least mildly uncomfortable. The only ones who seemed to be beating the heat were Luffy, Vivi, and well, Seal. You three don't seem to mind the hot climate at all, Nami commented, voicing Sanji's thoughts as she looked at the three in question. Well, I was born and raised on this island, VV said, smiling. You could say I'm used to it. I'd imagine the same is true for Seal. Said Dugong nodded confidently before flashing Nami what could be interpreted as a thumbs up minus the thumbs. Oh, I guess that makes sense, Nami said before turning to Luffy. But what about you? There aren't many deserts in East Blue. Nah, my home island had really good weather, Luffy replied. The reason I'm fine is that I can control my body temperature. This got the attention of the rest of the crew, especially Chopper, whose head perked up in interest despite his severe discomfort. You mean you can keep your body temperature steady at will? Nami asked in amazement. Is that even possible? I guess so. I do it with a technique called life return. It lets me stay cool in the heat or warm in the cold among other things. Life return? Chopper repeated in wonder. Come to think of it, you were walking around Drum Island in nothing but a t-shirt. Were you using the same thing back then? Luffy nodded. Yep, that's right. But what kind of technique is that? Chopper asked. His discomfort seemed to be momentarily forgotten, overshadowed by his interest in the medical phenomenon. It almost sounds like a type of biofeedback. Biofeed who? Luffy asked, his mouth suddenly watering at the thought of being fed. Biofeedback, Chopper corrected. It's an ability that a select few people can access through meditation and mental discipline. It allows them to achieve a higher degree of control over the body by exploiting its biological connection to the mind, gaining a greater awareness of bodily functions that most humans wouldn't be conscious of, and in turn being able to regulate them. Luffy said, nodding sagely. Fascinating. You didn't understand a word he said, did you? Zoro inferred. Nope. What's wrong with you? Nami asked in exasperation. He's saying that biofeedback is the scientific explanation for the technique you use, one which you evidently don't understand. Luffy stared at her, the conspicuous lack of comprehension evident on his blank face. Basically it's a mystery technique, Luffy, Zoro added. Ah, Luffy said, smacking his hand with his fist. Why didn't you just say so? Nami looked extremely annoyed now, whereas Chopper was in deep thought. Luffy, the reindeer suddenly spoke up. What else can you do with that technique? Luffy thought for a moment. A lot of things actually. For one, I can eat until I'm really fat and then turn all the food into pure muscle and energy. That's really useful before a fight. In fact, if I'm injured, it'll heal me to an extent. Chopper looked like he was in Candyland. His eyes were shining. That's amazing. You're manipulating the enzymes in your body in order to convert the nutrients in the food to suit your needs. From the sound of it, you can even speed up digestion. How did you learn to do that? Luffy scratched his head. I just sort of did it one day, he admitted. Come to think of it, when was the first time he did that? Was it in Impel Down? No, maybe Shabandi. He remembered healing injuries by eating meat since after his first fight with Crocodile, but that wasn't really an effect of the technique. Life return just let him do it faster. What else can you do? Chopper asked eagerly. Well, I can increase my resistance to pain and fatigue. So you can actively release adrenaline into your system. Yay, let's go with that. I think I can also counteract some types of poison. By forcing your immune system to create specific types of antibodies. Sure, why not? Other than that, it does let me automatically activate my gears and it also lets me maintain them longer. Gears? Sanji interrupted. What are those? They're ways that I can enhance my fighting style by taking advantage of my rubber body. Like this. Steam suddenly started rising from his body, which took on a red tint. Chopper's jaw dropped as he sat up. Luffy? You're showing signs of a dramatic increase in heart rate. He said in a panicked tone. Luffy just nodded as he continued smiling. Yep, that's gear second. It increases my strength and speed. The crew looked on in amazement. The one who was most impressed by far was Seal, who shouted a series of high-pitched barks that was unintelligible to anyone other than Chopper and evidently, Luffy. No, I can't teach you that. The only reason my body can withstand it is because I'm made of rubber. Seal looked deeply disappointed as he let out a noise akin to a sigh. Chopper's medical mind was going haywire. Are you insane, Luffy? Even if the increased blood flow enhances your bodily performance in the short term, the long-term effects could be catastrophic. You're putting way too much stress on your body. Ah, it's fine, Chopper. When I first started using it was exhausting, but now my body is much tougher. Plus, with life return I can control how much I increase the blood flow and choose which part of my body to direct the blood to. Like my muscles, or even a single limb. Actually, when he first started using it, he didn't realize that the blood was being distributed evenly throughout his body. It was before the crew was separated in Shabandi that Chopper had informed him that most of the extra blood he was pumping through his body was being wasted when he fought. Luffy? You're still in gear second as you're talking. Stop doing that. Chopper shouted indignantly. Luffy, realizing that he was right, quickly deactivated the technique. So is there gear third then? Sanji asked curiously. Luffy grinned. You bet. He raised his arm, and the limbs started to expand before their very eyes until it was the size of a giant's. The crew, minus Oro, looked on in shock. Usopp stumbled back. Seal pulled a quick 180 and was in awe again. What the hell? Your arm crew. Usopp shouted. Yep, because I inflated my bones. Cool huh? The crew stared dumbly and he laughed, shrinking his arm back down to normal size. So is there another one after that, or is that the limit? Usopp asked, his curiosity beyond piqued at this point. Luffy might have answered him, but VV chose that moment to point out a large rock formation that they could use for shade. The crew immediately rushed over to the rock, Usopp forgetting his own question entirely. Man, it really is hot out here, Nami complained. I wish we had something to ride. Like a camel maybe. Not all of us would fit on a camel though, VV pointed out. You're right, Nami admitted. A camel that only gave rides to us girls would be nice. VV's brow furrowed. What kind of camel is that? Nami shrugged. Is the plan in motion, Miss All Sunday? Crocodile asked. His tone contained a hint of impatience. It is, his partner agent replied. Mr. 2 has reported that his infiltration was successful. Good. Then our rebel friends should be arriving any minute now, Crocodile stated, turning around in his chair to face her. Make sure they're comfortable with our other guests. We're moving ahead of schedule. Tomorrow, we move into Alabasta. Miss All Sunday's features were carefully blank as she nodded. Yes, sir. The Strawwats were brought out of their antics when VV pointed at the horizon, and they all looked ahead to see the city of Alabasta off in the distance. We're almost there, she whispered. Your Majesty, I realize how severe the situation is, but what you're suggesting. I have no choice in the matter, King Cobra said gravely, cutting Chaka off. If negotiations are not to occur, our only choice is to move in against Crocodile. I will not raise arms against the people of Alabasta, however misled they may be in their assumptions. With all due respect, Pell began, if we were to attempt to apprehend Crocodile now, we would merely be adding fuel to the fire. It is a long distance between here and Rainbase. Crocodile would easily be able to read our intentions, and not only would our chance of success be slim at best, but he would be able to avoid a conflict completely if he so wished. He also has the backing of the people, regrettably more so than your Majesty at the moment. He paused. Right now, the rebel army's actions are unpredictable. If we were to move our troops to Rainbase now, what would happen? The king interrupted. Would we lose more face? Would the people denounce us? Would the rebel army take the palace? Is that what you're so worried about? Pell, Chaka, I've told you many times. A country is its people. Even if the royal army were to fall, so long as Crocodile is defeated, Alabasta will be rebuilt. But if we were to take up arms against our own people and walk right into that madman's hands, the only one celebrating in the end would be Baroque works. It matters not whether we still have the means to suppress the rebel army afterwards. They are not the enemy. My only target is Crocodile. He paused for a moment. Perhaps my rule may very well come to an end when all this is over. If that were to happen, it would be a small price to pay. Chaka's eyes widened. Your Majesty, I underestimated his resolve. What sheer force of will. Pell, however, did not look so convinced, which did not escape the king's notice. Is there something else I should consider? He asked suddenly. Chaka and Pell were his most trusted advisors, and despite all his experience, he couldn't account for everything. Their plan is flawless, Pell began, so long as we can detain Crocodile. Chaka looked toward his longtime friend in curiosity, while the king's stony features remained blank. Go on. Pell looked him directly in the eye. Our enemy is one of the 7 royal warlords. We all know the kind of power such an individual possesses, even alone. To be perfectly honest, I don't think even the entirety of our forces could take him on. The king contemplated this for a moment. Do you merely mean to point out that there is no one in our country who can oppose Crocodile? If all you have to say is that the situation is hopeless, I don't want to hear it, he said with authority. Not at all, Pell amended quickly. What you said may very well be true. There may not be anyone in Alabasta who can take him on. But that does not make the situation hopeless. The king's eyes widened as he caught on. The world government. Pell nodded. I think it is of the utmost necessity that we enlist their aid, he said. I don't think that would work, Chaka stated. Against a government-sanctioned pirate. You know how extensive the privileges granted to the royal warlords are. We would need sufficient proof of such an accusation, proof which we don't have. I'm not sure they would be willing to help us without solid evidence. They might, Pell said. You know as well as I do, Chaka. Due to the unique history of the Alabastian throne, we are not just any affiliated nation to the world government. Our privileges run as deep, if not deeper, than those of the 7 warlords, all things considered. Realization dawned on Chaka's face, and King Cobra almost looked annoyed. "And you suggest we use this to our advantage?" he asked. "I don't think he have a choice. It may be our only hope," Pal said somberly. Nearly a minute passed as the king considered the idea. To abuse such a connection, it would leave a very bad taste in his mouth. But if the country could be saved, the benefit would far outweigh any personal grievances he had. He opened his mouth and was about to announce his decision when a guard stormed into the room. "Your Majesty," he exclaimed, nearly out of breath. The 3 were visibly startled. "What is it?" Chaka asked. "It's VV. She's arrived." Pal and Chaka straightened, and Cobra immediately headed towards the door. "Did you show her in?" the king asked. "Yes, Your Majesty, but she had unexpected visitors with her." "Paid no mind. I will personally greet my daughter, as well as our guests." Pal, Chaka. The 2 royal guard commanders followed him out. When VV had told him that her traveling companions were pirates, King Cobra's uncertainty was easily outweighed by his gratefulness towards their unknown benefactors. He had many visions of what this pirate crew would be like. This was not one of them. Upon entering the lobby of the royal palace, he was greeted by the sight of a small bipedal cross between a raccoon and a reindeer, a long-nosed man who was currently telling the creature some outrageously outlandish story, a woman with beery signs for eyes, who was currently admiring a set of historical relics, as though she might swipe them at any second. A swirly-browed man in a suit and tie who was not so subtly hitting on her and being ignored, and a man in a straw hat who was in the middle of what looked to be a sparring session with a kung fu dugong. The only level-headed member of their group seemed to be a man with 3 swords strapped to his hip who was leaning against the wall with a bored countenance. If not for his vibrant and unusual hair color, one might think he was the only normal one among them. That is, if you didn't count VV. The king shouted as he dashed up to his daughter whom he hadn't seen in over 2 years. She wrapped his arms around him, reassuring him that she was okay. As much as he wanted to catch up, he knew there were more important matters to attend to, which VV wasted no time in addressing. "Father, where is Koza? Did he leave already? How did the negotiations go?" The room suddenly fell silent and VV started to get worried. "Father." "VV," Pell spoke up, "Koza never came." The princess went still, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Many of the Strawats had the same reaction. The only ones from their group who didn't seem surprised, Pell noted, were the man in the straw hat and the one with the green hair. "But that can't." VV couldn't seem to find the right words to convey her disbelief. "VV," the king began, "yesterday, when the negotiations were supposed to take place, Koza and his guard never arrived at the palace. After some time, we discreetly sent out a search party. All we found was an abandoned carriage with no horse in the middle of the desert en route from Katoria." VV's eyes widened, and after a few seconds, she sank to her knees. "No," she whispered. Koza. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes as the king, Chaka, and Pell tried to find words to comfort her. The Strawats all looked unusually somber. Beside them, Luffy and Zoro shared a glance, and Luffy nodded. "VV," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him. "Don't lose hope. We can still fix this." "But Luffy-san," she protested weakly, "if they took Koza," she trailed off. "Then we just need to get him back," Luffy said firmly. After a long moment, VV pulled herself together and stood up. "You're right," she said, with newfound resolve. The king and his followers stared in awe at the scene. "Are they really pirates?" Chaka couldn't help but wonder. "It looks like you two were right," Sanji said suddenly, motioning to Luffy and Zoro. "Crocodile won't just stop, and he won't let us do as we please. If we want to stop this war, we have to take him down." "We were considering that," Pell said, fully willing to share their plans with these pirates after the scene he had just witnessed. "But we can't understand Crocodile's motive in this. Even if the rebel army was unaware that negotiations were supposed to take place, they aren't likely to act without their leader. No matter how angry a viper is, it can't bite without its head. If anything, this should stall them." "Maybe not," Zoro said, speaking up for the first time. All eyes turned to him. "VV, are there any agents in Baroque works who specialize in impersonation?" VV's eyes widened. "Now that you mention it, Mr. 2 is rumored to have an ability like that, but I've never met him." Pell turned to Zoro curiously. "Do you think they mean to impersonate Koza?" he asked. "Most likely," Zoro replied. "We have to assume that this wasn't just an act of desperation. We'll work with the assumption that they have a plan, and then we'll plan accordingly. That way, we'll be prepared for the worst-case scenario." Chaka and Pell both nodded in approval of the logic. "So what do you propose?" Chaka asked. "In order to unmask the impostor, we need the real Koza," Zoro said. "That's why one of our priorities should be to liberate him from Rain Base." "That won't be an easy operation," Pell commented. "Which is why we'll be sending Zoro," Luffy spoke up. He'll get it done, don't worry. King Cobra, Pell, and Chaka looked uncertain, but nodded in agreement. I'd like to go too, Vivi said. Zoro consented to the request. The king and his advisors looked worried, but Vivi assured them that she would be fine. I hate to bring this up, Chaka said, but how do you know that Koza is still? We don't, Luffy stated. Though knowing Croc, he's alive for the moment. That's why our other priority is to take down Baroque Works. The king's two advisors now looked at him like he's insane, but the king merely stared at him thoughtfully. Do you think you can do that? He asked. Luffy smirked. I know we can, he replied. Just leave everything to us. Chaka and Pell still looked skeptical, but the king simply nodded. Then we will rely on you. Sorry for the trouble, he said respectfully. Luffy just grinned. Don't worry about it. Zoro turned to Luffy. There is one more precaution we should take, he said. Luffy nodded while the others wondered what they were talking about. Our enemy specializes in impersonation. If we succeed in revealing him to the rebel army, he may try to impersonate one of us next. So we'll need a way to ensure that we can trust each other. BV agreed to the plan he proposed, and after all the Straw Hats were marked with the symbol of their camaraderie, she headed towards Rainbase on Karu's back, along with Zoro, who, to his slight displeasure, rode atop the back of one of the Super Spot Build Duck squad. The rest of the Straw Hats agreed to wait in Alabasta, seeing as Baroque Works would most likely arrive there along with the rebel army. Today, the conflict would be set in motion. In a certain bar in an active district of Alabasta, a white-haired man with a large jut strapped to his back sat in silence, along with a blue-haired woman with a sword on her hip. Smoker-san. Tashigi spoke up, breaking the silence. Why do you think that Straw Hat is in Alabasta? Just a feeling, the white hunter replied, taking a swig of his drink. Tashigi was silent for a moment before speaking again. Are you planning to confront him again? She asked quietly. Why do you even need to ask? Smoker said in an annoyed tone. Your injuries from last time just healed. Smoker glared at her, and she fell silent. Deciding it wasn't right to misplace his aggression onto her, he turned away. I have some questions for him, was all he said, indicating that the conversation was over. Tashigi took the hint and sipped her drink, leaving Smoker in deep thought. Straw Hat, why am I still alive? Face expressionless. They call me, he paused. Mr. Two leaned forward, full attention on the one who claimed to know him. Straw Hat bastard, he finished. Mr. Two-Face faltered, horrified by the complete waste of buildup. He quickly got up and growled. I thought I told you to stop joking around. He shouted as he attempted a jump kick on the stranger, who moved his head out of the way with practiced ease. But I'm not joking. Everyone calls me that. It's so annoying. He complained. Faced with a drastic change in demeanor, Mr. Two's jaw dropped. This guy just went from intimidating to mocking to whiny in less than 30 seconds. Suddenly, Mr. Two remembered where he'd seen the man's face before. It was on a bounty poster of a wanted pirate whose head was worth almost as much as Mr. One's. That pirate just happened to be the same guy who had thrown a wrench into Mr. Zero's plans. You're Straw Hat, Luffy, he gasped. Luffy cocked his head to the side. Took you long enough, he said. Mr. Two got into a defensive stance. How'd you know it was me? He asked, eyes narrowed. I know a lot of things, Luffy said, smirking. Mr. Two matched his smirk challengingly. Oh? Then I guess I'll just have to kill you. Luffy hummed in thought. Or you could betray Crocodile. Mr. Two raised an eyebrow. And why would I do that? He asked suspiciously. I'll be your friend, Luffy offered. Mr. Two froze. So that's it. A promise of friendship extended to an enemy. He found himself getting slightly emotional despite himself. Actually, Luffy continued, I'm not really sure why you joined Baroque Works in the first place. But hey, I guess everyone's gotta put meat on the table. Rather than correcting the misspoken idiom, Mr. Two focused on the first part. Well, he had a point. Joining Baroque Works had been a spur-of-the-moment decision for him. To be honest, he only did it because he was bored and being a secret agent sounded cool at the time. Interesting proposition, he said after a moment. But I won't be swayed by a few choice words. Once an Akama has chosen his allegiance, he won't defect so easily. Luffy hummed in thought. Okay, then, how about this? We fight it out. If you win, you can steal my identity and use it against my crew. If I win, you have to help us fight Baroque Works. I'm going to kick Croc's ass anyway. Mr. Two's brow furrowed. That's a win-win the way I see it, he admitted. I'd sure like to kick that Mr. One's ass. But what makes you think I'll uphold my end of the deal? Because we're friends. Mr. Two's jaw dropped. Such trust in someone he just met. I would shame myself as an Akama if I didn't match his resolve. Fine, Straw Hat. I accept your challenge. He shouted as he charged at the grinning pirate. 2 p.m., Rain Base. "Hey bomb guy," Kibi said, quite nonchalantly considering the situation at hand, "haven't you learned yet that that's useless? The noise is starting to hurt my ears." Mr. Five ceased his continuous battering of the cage bars to glare at the one questioning him. "Would you happen to have a better idea?" Miss Valentine asked in an annoyed tone. She was constantly keeping pressure on the wound in her abdomen, with limited success. Luckily it wasn't fatal, but that didn't mean she could brush it off. "If I did, far be it from me to keep it to myself," Kibi retorted, rubbing his mildly concussed head. "That crossdresser really kicked hard." "He's right, Mr. Five," came the voice of Miss Goldenweek. "There's a reason why Crocodile left you and Miss Valentine without cuffs. It's because he was confident you couldn't escape from this sea stone cage. The only one who could really get us out of here is Mr. 3. The only reason I'm cuffed myself is because Mr. Zero probably didn't know the full range of my abilities. Even if you were fully healed and had more room to use your power, you wouldn't make a dent. As it stands, you're just aggravating your own wound and risking blowing us all up." Mr. Five grunted. "So are we just supposed to stand here and wait for our deaths?" he asked. "No, but possibly making the water flow in faster isn't the solution," she reasoned. Miss Valentine gulped as she took note of the rising water level in the room. If it kept going on like this, they would drown within minutes. She looked toward Mr. 3. He was usually the one who calmly analyzed the situation and came up with a plan, but he looked just as hopeless as the rest of them and ever more despondent. There wasn't much he could do with those handcuffs on him. It quite simply seemed like there was no way out of this cage. And even if they did somehow get out, the room was crawling with bananadiles. "There is something we could try," Mr. 3 said suddenly, though his voice was subdued. They all looked at him questioningly, even Koza, who hadn't spoken a word since regaining consciousness. Mr. 3 gestured toward the giant crocodiles outside the cage. "Bananadiles are said to be able to chew through iron. Maybe if we can provoke one." "Hey! Get over here you goddamn banana." Mr. 5 started shouting. "Make yourself useful, you stupid reptile growing out of a phallic-shaped fruit." The others didn't bother to correct him, opting to watch in anticipation as one of the bananadiles trudged forward toward the cage, glaring at Mr. 5, opened its jaws. Then broke all its teeth trying to bite the cage. Their high hopes plummeting, the former Baroque Works agents and rebel army leaders slumped back in defeat. "We're all going to die, aren't we?" Miss Valentine bemoaned. As the water continued to flow into the room, Koza looked down and gritted his teeth. "I've failed our country. VV, I'm sorry." "Apology accepted." They all looked toward the source of the sound, startled. The voice had come from outside the cage. They were shocked to see the Alabastian air wading through the water towards them. She wore a relieved smile. "Koza, Kibi, you're both okay. I'm so glad," she said. "VV. How did you find us?" Kibi asked in amazement as Koza simply stared, as if doubting his own eyes. The agents all gaped at the sight of their former enemy. "Well, I had some help," she admitted, just as another figure came around the cage and appeared next to her. Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine stiffened. "Rororano?" the latter questioned, rubbing the ghost of her scar from Whiskey Peak. "What are you doing here?" Mr. 5 growled. Zoro shrugged in apathy. "Saving your lives, evidently. You should save the smartest remarks for after you've found a way to open the cage," Mr. 3 drawled. Zoro responded by unstrapping one sheathed sword. "I'm not that good at cutting sea stone at this point," he admitted. "But I think I can manage. Wax guy, I need you to come closer to the bars." Mr. 3 blinked, but figured that he didn't have time to doubt any plan they proposed and stepped forward. Zoro stepped back and gripped his sheath as if he were about to draw the blade as Mr. 3 started to catch on. If he was skeptical, he didn't show it. If he was worried about getting his hands cut off, he didn't voice it. Something had changed within him since the encounter with the higher-ups of Baroque Works, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by his partner and the 5 pair. "Hey, are you crazy?" Mr. 5 shouted. "What are you trying to do, amputate him?" Miss Valentine and Miss Goldenweek looked a bit worried as well, but Zoro ignored them all as he committed his full focus to his target. "My technique will have to evolve. Faster, harder, sharper. For the lion to sharpen its fangs, it must first embrace its nature, the reaping of the dead. Its roar is the prelude to carnage. To its prey, its song is a chilling death chant." Miss Valentine groaned. "What the hell is this dumbest talking about? One sword-style lion's elegy." The swordsman drew his blade and sheathed it in one fluid motion. The former agents and rebels watched in awe as the cuffs on Mr. 3's wrist split cleanly down the middle and fell to the floor with a clang. The wax man raised his wrists and stared at them in shock. He hadn't felt a thing. He looked back to Zoro, who was panting slightly. "Make a key and open the cage," the swordsman instructed. "Alright," Mr. 3 said dumbly, before forming a small rod with his powers and inserting it into the cage's lock. The wax morphed to fit the mechanism and the lock clicked open. Zoro proceeded to open the door and they all filed out of the cage just as Mr. Three's strength started to be drained once again by the rising water. Great, now how do we get out of here? There are 4 devil fruit users. Mr. 5 lamented as he struggled to stay above the surface. 3 sword-style rising whirlwind. The bomb man's question was answered as they were all engulfed in a strong wind that blew the surrounding water away. One might have assumed their plan was to clear a path through the water had the whirlwind not proceeded to carry them up towards the ceiling, which was quickly cut open by the talented swordsman. Soon, the 4 agents, the 2 rebels and the 2 strawats were making their way out of Rain Diners, ignoring the gobsmacked expressions of the gamblers who had been witnesses to the event. 3 p.m., outskirts of Alabasta. The Baroque Works officer agents that had not defected from the organization felt the temperature of the desert air fall drastically as their boss took in the scene before them. Thousands of rebel soldiers were unconscious on the ground as if they had all been the victims of some type of chemical warfare. But from the looks of it, they were all alive. It was a frightening scene to behold, but not as frightening as the expression on Sir Crocodile's face. What could have done this? Miss All Sunday wondered aloud, voicing the thoughts of the other 4 agents. The question is not what, Crocodile said, more to himself than to anyone else. It's who. Miss All Sunday's eyes widened. You think the Strawats? But Crocodile paid her question no mind, lost in his own thoughts. It couldn't have been Strawat. A man worth 45 million in this part of the Grand Line, an awakened conqueror. Preposterous. But then who? This would mean that the rest of the rebel army has lost contact with the vanguard, Miss All Sunday analyzed. The next logical step would be to have them send more, but Mr. 2 is nowhere to be found. Without him, a large part of our plan is compromised. Thanks for the status report, Crocodile growled. Do you think I'm stupid? She wisely held her tongue. You 4, he said, motioning to the 1 in 4 pairs find Mr. 2 by whatever means necessary. If you see any strawats along the way, I want you to disembowel them. Mr. 1 smirked, satisfied with the choice of words. Miss All Sunday, you come with me. We're going to extract the king and question him about the object of our search. Hey Tashigi. The marine swordsman looked up at the one who had addressed her in question. What is it, Smoker-san? She didn't want to comment on the fact that there had still been no sign of the strawats. It seemed to be their style to cause a ruckus, so the fact that everything seemed normal probably meant that Smoker's hunch had been incorrect. Do you find something weird about the state of this town? Smoker asked. Tashigi looked around, wondering what he meant. After a moment, she turned back to him and shook her head. Logically, there should be a large concentration of royal soldiers stationed around Alabasta, the smokeman elaborated. Alabasta is in the midst of a civil war, so the rebels could attack any time. But there are no troops anywhere. It's almost as if the king isn't expecting an attack or isn't planning to fight back. Either assumption demands an explanation. Tashigi nodded slowly, catching on. So you think there is more going on? She asked uncertainly. I think there's something that we're not seeing, Smoker confirmed. He was silent for a moment. I think we should take a trip to the royal palace, he said finally. Tashigi smiled lightly. Is this another one of your hunches? Smoker just grunted. 2 of them are coming, Luffy noted. Nami looked worried. Which ones? The Mr. 0 pair, he said calmly, causing Usopp's eyes to widen. What Crocodile and Miss All Sunday are coming here. Why? He's after this country's throne. So I'd imagine they're coming for the king, Luffy said. It'll be bad to fight in the palace, so I'll go meet them outside when they arrive. The others looked concerned but nodded. What about the other agents, Luffy? Sanji asked. Luffy's brow furrowed in concentration. They've split up. They're probably looking for you, he said, turning to Mr. 2, who had introduced himself to the crew as Bentham. Sadakama hummed in thought, absently rubbing the rather large bump on his head. Did he have a concussion? Karma really was a bitch. Those guys know they won't be able to find me if I don't want to be found, especially since they know about my ability. That means they think I'm still on their side and that I've most likely been captured. If they don't find me soon, they'll most likely come here, even if it's just to report to Mr. 0. Well, we can't have that. Luffy said jovially. So you guys will just have to take them on, he said, turning to the rest of the crew. Luckily, our new friend had all their faces memorized and was able to show us. Sanji, bring Bentham with you and take out the blade guy. Sanji grinned confidently. Sure thing, Captain. Nami, you take out the spiky lady, Luffy continued. Nami raised an eyebrow. Tall woman, blue curly hair, walks weird, Bentham supplied. She'll be close to Mr. 1, so I can help you find her. Nami nodded, albeit a little nervously, and twirled her new weapon in her hand. Usopp, Chopper, Seal, you guys take out the slow guy. Big blonde dude with a giant bat. And the mole lady. Short old woman, red hair, talks weird. Seal let out a squeal of excitement. Usopp and Chopper were not so confident. Chopper was nervous about his first real fight as a member of the Straw Hats, while Usopp's legs were shaking, but he nevertheless tried to hide his conspicuous fear. Just leave it to the great Captain Usopp. Maybe I can just take them all 80. Alright men. Move out. Luffy shouted. Right. As the four pair continued their fruitless search for Mr. 2, Miss Merry Christmas grew increasingly annoyed. This is ridiculous. How hard can it be to fin a man dresses as a ballerina? Cool BEDES. What in tarnation are you trying to say for? Spit I out already, you idiot. Excused, Mr. 4 finished. Miss Merry Christmas thought for a moment. Disguised? You think he's hiding from us? She asked. Mr. 4 shrugged, which took a total of 5 seconds. Stop being so slow at everything, idiot. Certain death. Paralysis star. Mr. 4 and Miss Merry Christmas both felt a stinging sensation in their backs and reflexively yanked out the objects that had penetrated their skin from behind, although Mr. 4 took noticeably longer to do so. What the hell? Needles. Paralytic agents, Chopper supplied. Those needles are coated in a drug that will weaken your muscles temporarily. Why the hell is this reindeer talking to us? Despite her disbelief, she could already start to feel the effects on her body and had to morph into her hybrid's own form to help stave them off. She noted that Mr. 4 was still able to move due to his sheer muscle mass. Give up now. Usopp shouted in what he hoped was an intimidating tone of voice, despite his still shaking legs. Or else my 8 million followers will come and kick your asses. This isn't getting us anywhere, Mr. 1. If he wanted to be found, we'd have found him by now, Miss Doublefinger reasoned as they walked down a deserted road. It's as I thought, Mr. 1 said. His partner looked at him questioningly. He hasn't been captured. He's defected. As much as I hate to admit it, he's not pathetic enough to be captured by the enemy while in disguise. To begin with, there's no one that knows about his power other than us. We have to assume that this was his plan. But why would he desert the organization? What's his motive? Miss Doublefinger asked. Hell if I know. Hey, you two. A voice shouted from behind them. They were instantly on guard, but relaxed when they saw the man in a Royal Army uniform. It's dangerous here. There are rumors that the rebel army is going to invade. You should get back to your homes, the man continued as he walked up to them. Miss Doublefinger couldn't help but raise an amused eyebrow. Don't worry about us, Mr. 1 said emotionlessly. We're not civilians. Oh? The soldier asked, his mouth contorting into a familiar-looking grin that instantly put Mr. 1 on guard. Well, that works out perfectly. Because neither am I. Mr. 1 had just enough time to turn his body into steel as the soldier's leg impacted with the side of his face. He was sent crashing into the side of a nearby building. Miss Doublefinger jumped back in shock, but her face morphed into a scowl as she saw a familiar face covered in makeup. Got ya? Bentham exclaimed as he lowered his hand from his face. Behind him, a blonde-haired man in a suit and tie walked out of an alleyway wordlessly. Mr. 2. So you did betray us, Miss Doublefinger said, eyes narrowed. The name's Bentham now, honey. Feel free to wear it out. Miss Doublefinger wasted no time and charged at the shapeshifter, spiked fingers ready to impale, but she was suddenly sent rocketing back by what felt like an incredibly strong wind. Air pressure tempo. Miss Doublefinger looked around, searching for the source of the disembodied voice, to no avail. What was going on? From the broken wall of the nearby building, Mr. 1 climbed out of the wreckage, exuding a frigid rage. I've been waiting for this, you scum. Now, what's your favorite internal organ? That would be your heart, shithead, Bentham said mockingly. Mr. 1 let out an enraged roar and charged at him. I've been waiting for you, Croc. Crocodile narrowed his eyes. You're Straw Hat Luffy. Oh, so you know me. That makes things easier. Why don't we skip the formalities and get right to the part where I kick your ass around the block? Crocodile let out a low growl as Miss All Sunday giggled beside him. You're in over your head, Straw Hat. I've buried hundreds of rookies like you. You're about to learn how out of your depth you are. Nice speech, Luffy drawled. Is that what Whitebeard told you? Crocodile's vein was clearly visible over his forehead as he sent a large wave of sand in Luffy's direction. The rubber man jumped over it and landed smoothly. I'm going to enjoy impaling you, fool. Are you sure I'm the fool here? Luffy asked with a grin before slipping into his Sanji persona. Hello, you've reached the shitty restaurant. What would you like to order? Crocodile's eyes narrowed in further outrage. Miss All Sunday, who had been present during the conversation, couldn't contain her mirth any longer and burst into a fit of laughter. Is something funny? Crocodile seethed. Perhaps I should kill you too, Nico Robin. Don't test the limits of my rationality. Right now, I'm fucking pissed. Do as you wish, Robin replied. But whatever happened to your promise not to call me by that name? It's really too bad. Your real name sounds a lot better than that codename you go by, Luffy commented, to her slight surprise. Crocodile was much too livid to care at the moment. "And you," Luffy continued, turning to the Warlord. "You can say that I'm a fool, that I'm a rookie with no idea what I'm getting into, that I'm in over my head. But that changes nothing." He cracked his knuckles and his expression turned menacing before their very eyes. "You think you're pissed? You don't know what pissed is." Crocodile watched in shock as the rookie's fist darkened to obsidian. "Armaments hockey. You make my crewmate cry, you threaten her country with war, you plan to steal a force you can't hope to control, and you kill because it's fun. You have made me very pissed. And you're gonna regret it." As quickly as it changed, his fist went back to normal. "She's so weak, but she tries her best to save everyone. She can't bear the thought of loss, so she's always in pain. She wants the civil war to end without anyone dying." It took Crocodile a moment to realize that he was talking about Princess Vivi. "There are many sentimental fools like that," he responded. "People like her don't know death. They don't know the truth of battle. You're a pirate, aren't you? You should agree with me, at the very least." "Yay, I do," Luffy replied. But his eyes hardened. "I'll let her keep her naivety a little longer. I'll make her desire real. I'm going to save this country and I'm not going to let anyone get in my way." Crocodile snarled. "Whether it's you, the Marines, or even death itself." "Straw Hat," a voice shouted. Crocodile and Robin both looked up to see Smoker, the White Hunter, standing on a nearby rooftop, along with a blue-haired woman with a sword strapped to her hip. Crocodile's surprise grew. He knew they were coming. Observation hockey too. Then could he have been the one who? His train of thought was interrupted as Smoker leapt down from the roof. "So you were here, Straw Hat. I had a feeling." Luffy sighed. "You and your feelings, Smokey. How are your injuries healing?" Smoker scoffed. "Fine, thanks for asking. Now I have some questions for you." "Can it wait 10 minutes? I'm kind of in the middle of something." "Right, that's my first question. What the hell is Crocodile doing here in Alabasta?" Crocodile, meanwhile, was seething again. 10 minutes. Who does this damn brat think he is? His anger seeking an outlet, Crocodile dispersed into sand and flew at Luffy, who parried the swipe of the golden hook with his hand. It wasn't long before Smoker and Tashigi joined the fray, while Robin stood back passively and watched a battle ensue. "Leave me alone, Smokey." Luffy shouted as he dodged yet another jab from the Loja user's jut. He was immediately forced to keep moving as Crocodile's hand reached out to grab him. "Well, this is annoying. If either of these guys land a hit, I'm crippled." He was broken out of his thoughts as Tashigi jumped over his other two opponents and swiped at him with her sword. He quickly caught her sword with his bare hand, a simple hockey coating, ensuring that he didn't get cut, and pulled, using the weapon to block Smoker's jut. He then kicked Smoker out of the way, sending him flying across the sand. Seeing Crocodile homing in again, he then deliberately pushed Tashigi toward the Sandman. She yelped in surprise as her sword blackened in her hands, and Crocodile's eyes widened as he swayed back to avoid the armament's hardened blade. Meanwhile, Robin was watching the fight play out curiously. She could tell that the Straw Hat captain was playing with them, which surprised her. She never thought she'd see the day when she saw a rookie pirate treat a fight with a royal warlord like a joke. But that wasn't bothering her as much as what he had said earlier. "You plan to steal a force you can't hope to control." He was talking about Pluton. But how? How could he possibly know that the weapon was hidden in this country, let alone that Crocodile was searching for it? The warlord himself was too angry at the moment to stop and think about the implications of what he had heard. But if there was one thing Robin was good at, it was keeping a clear head. She thought back to her first encounter with Monkey D. Luffy, back in Whiskey Peak. He had known who she was right off the bat, but what he said back then hadn't been a threat so much as a warning. A warning not to underestimate him. It wasn't even hostility, really. It was only natural given how she had been antagonizing his new crewmate. Yes, she had been playing games with the princess, allowing her to discover Mr. Zero's identity, only to inform him later on. She had taken the warning for what it meant. If she was going to play games, she would lose. If she hadn't thought much of it at first, seeing him taking on Crocodile and the White Hunter at the same time, along with the revelation that he knew about Pluton, may have changed her perspective a bit. "What's wrong, Robin? Not going to join in?" came the man's voice. Robin just stared at him. He wasn't mocking her, so much as joking around. Why was he acting this way around his enemy? She supposed he might just not view her as a threat, but his tone was almost playful, as if it was completely natural for him to act friendly towards her, of all the ridiculous things in the world. She suddenly wanted to test something out. Her curiosity getting the better of her, she threw caution to the wind and crossed her arms, copies of which suddenly sprouted all over the Straw Hat captain's body. Smoker and Tashigi suddenly stopped attacking. Smoker looked over to her, as if considering her presence for the first time. Crocodile also stopped and shot an annoyed glare at her. "Insufferable woman. He's mine to kill," the Sandman shouted. But Robin made no other move against the pirate who simply stood there, seemingly trapped in her grip. And then he smiled at her. "Well, are you going to do it or not?" he asked. "To be honest, I'd prefer if you didn't." Robin's eyes widened. What is he playing at? There's no way I really have him beat. Why doesn't he retaliate? Suddenly, Crocodile lost his patience and lunged at Luffy. While the two marines didn't want to attack him while he was seemingly immobilized, the Warlord was less hesitant as his arm morphed into a crescent of sand. Later Robin would tell herself that the reason she let go was simply because she was startled. But she had never been too good at fooling herself. The hands dematerialized and Luffy jumped out of the way of the attack that could have sucked every drop of water from his body. Crocodile suddenly started laughing. "If you think you can save this country by dodging all day, by all means try," he said. Smoker looked over at Crocodile, curiosity piqued. "Save this country? What are you talking about, pirate?" Crocodile shot him an annoyed glare. "Stay out of it, marine scum." Smoker's eyes narrowed. "He was planning to overthrow this country during the chaos of the rebellion," Luffy stated. "He's the leader of an underground organization called Baroque Works. He goes by the name Mr. Zero." Smoker's eyes widened in realization at the sound of the code name. It took him a moment to think things through. "So that's what's going on here," he said quietly. Crocodile growled in agitation. Suddenly, he removed the golden casing on his hooked hand and revealed the poison metal underneath. "You escort the princess here. You take down my agents time and again. You take out the rebel army, foiling my plans one after another, and now you've gotten the marines involved. It's time I treat you like the nuisance you really are, Strawwet Luffy." The crazed grin manifested on the man's face. "But for all of your efforts, you will not succeed. This country will not be saved. And do you know why? Is it because you had a bomb in the clock tower?" Luffy asked. Robin watched as for the first time since she had met him, Sir Crocodile's eyes widened in shock. "What? When? How?" "Your agent told me," Luffy said, grinning. Crocodile stared dumbly before he realized what Luffy was implying and his face morphed into a menacing scowl. He stood there for a moment, shaking with rage as he tried to regain his composure. Meanwhile, Smoker turned back to Luffy. "What bomb? What are you talking about, Strawwet?" "There's a bomb set to go off at 4 p.m. in the clock tower. If we don't stop it, Alabasta will be engulfed in a blast big enough to level the city." Smoker's eyes widened slightly while Tashigi gasped. Luffy thought for a moment. "Actually, this is perfect. Would you guys mind stopping the bombing while I beat this guy up?" he asked pointing at the Warlord. Tashigi looked at Smoker uncertainly. Strictly speaking, protocol demanded that they stay out of the affairs of the Warlords unless ordered otherwise. But if they waited for proof in this situation, there was no telling what could happen. If Strawwet was telling the truth, a lot of people would pay the price for their negligence. "We're leaving Tashigi," Smoker said, seemingly coming to the same conclusion. Tashigi nodded quickly and followed the marine captain, but they were quickly cut off by Crocodile in his Loja form. "Did you think I'd just let you go?" he asked in a low tone as he aimed his poisonous hook at Tashigi. Knowing that Smoker would be intangible, he was hoping this would throw the smoke man off. His plan was foiled, however, when Smoker blocked the hook with his sea stone jut. Crocodile responded by grabbing the jut by its shaft, which was made of normal stone. The weapon suddenly dissolved into sand, causing Smoker to grunt in shock. Crocodile swiped at him this time, but he dissolved into smoke. As Crocodile raised his hook again, the smoke homed in on him, but he too fell back into his Loja form. Tashigi had her sword up at the ready to block the hook, but she was unable to anticipate the path of the disembodied arm. Gum Desert Eagle. Luffy's blackened hand impacted with Crocodile's face, sending him skidding across the ground until he finally righted himself, looking disheveled and livid, but no worse for the wear. "Your opponent is me," Luffy shouted as he appeared right in front of the Sandman again. His fist, which was pointed at his opponent, was still blackened, but now they could see it had a red tinge to it and it appeared to be steaming. Crocodile raised a hand to the ugly red bruise on his face. When he brought it down and saw the blood, his face darkened. "I've had enough," he said quietly, as all the sand in the area started to rise and swirl. Luffy turned to Smoker and Tashigi and nodded at them. Smoker stared at him for a few seconds before returning the nod. He signaled to Tashigi, and they both left the scene. "Are you sure?" Luffy asked, addressing the Warlord. "Because I'm just getting started. Why are these guys so weird?" Usopp complained as he pushed himself off the ground, attempting to recover from the near miss of the last explosion. "They talk weird, they fight weird, and their cannon is a frickin' dog. They're weirder than you are, Chopper." "Take that back, you asshole." Chopper yelled indignantly. "Why are you getting offended? Fine, you're weirder. Are you happy?" "No." Seal let out a low whine, telling them to stop arguing. "Seal's right. We have to focus on beating these guys. Usopp, give us some cover." "Okay." The poison should at least slow them down enough for our plan to work. To be honest, every fiber of his being was telling him to run away from this forsaken fight. But he knew he could never look VV or any of his other crewmates in the eye if he did that. He was a strawwat too, and he needed pull his weight. Soon after they had arrived, the Mr. 4 pair had altered the field to their advantage, and now there were mole holes all over the battlefield. The mole lady was digging around in them, which was part of their plan. When the dog shot another explosive ball at them, Usopp matched it with an explosive star, causing it to explode before it reached them. Next he pulled out a wide-scale smoke bomb. Certain death. Smoke star. He yelled as he shot it at the dog. The area became shrouded in a thick veil, and the dog looked around on confusion, not knowing where to aim as Chopper, Usopp, and Seal ran around under their cover. Their plan was impeded, however, as Miss Merry Christmas grabbed Usopp's foot from below. "That won't work on me, bastard. I can smell ya." Usopp gasped as the mole woman pulled him towards a brick building. He gritted his teeth, preparing for impact, and coughed up blood as he impacted face first into the brick wall. He fell over backwards, but Chopper quickly caught him in walk point. "Are you okay, Usopp?" he shouted in concern. Usopp wheezed. "I'm fine," he insisted. "Stick to the plan." "Right." Usopp handed the human reindeer a Tabasco star, and Chopper used his nose to track down the dog. Miss Merry Christmas continued to pester him as he ran, but seeing as he could smell her too, he was able to avoid her in walk point. He quickly shoved the Tabasco star into the dog's mouth. The canine gun hybrid's eyes started to water, and right as he was about to sneeze, Chopper went into heavy point and shoved his face down into one of the holes. A series of explosions could be heard beneath the ground, along with the comparatively faint screams of a certain mole woman. When she climbed out of the hole, smoking and burned but still conscious, Seal leapt at her and punched her across the face, letting out what was probably his equivalent of a battle cry. Miss Merry Christmas swiped at him with her claws, but the damage from the explosions and the effects of the drug were stacking up and taking a major toll on her, and Seal easily dodged. He then launched into a furious combo that completely betrayed his appearance. He ended with an uppercut that finally rendered the mole woman unconscious. "Way to go, Seal," Usopp shouted, regaining his bearings. Finally, the smoke started to clear, and Mr. 4 was shocked to see his partner defeated. Rumble. Chopper ate a rumble ball, determined not to let up. The dog, now over its fit of sneezing, shot another ball at the reindeer, who went into jump point and leapt over it. As he switched in between jump point and walk point, homing in on Mr. 4 all the while, the dog continually missed him. Finally, the dog waited and took aim while he was in the air. Certain death. Explosive star. The explosive projectile was shot directly into the dog's mouth, courtesy of Usopp, and its eyes widened as both bombs went off in its jaw. It didn't get up after that. Mr. 4 was still processing the fact that he was alone now when he was hit across the face by Seal. He recoiled but brushed off the hit and swung his bat, which narrowly missed the Kung Fu Dugong. He was then hit in the head by another explosive star, leaving an opening for Chopper. Hakute, Rizao. Chopper implanted his hoof into the same spot, causing Mr. 4 to groan in pain. Nevertheless, he swung his bat in one last act of defiance. As he was in the air, Chopper had no choice but to use guard point. The hit was still devastating. If the monster of a man hadn't been disoriented and weakened, Chopper was convinced he wouldn't be getting up for a long time. Mr. 4 recovered momentarily and raised his bat again, but his hand was hit with yet another explosive star, and he dropped the bat. Seal took the chance to land another hit on his head, and the force of the blow was finally enough to cause him to reel back. He caught himself on his back foot but couldn't recover in time to defend against Chopper, who had recovered himself. Hakute, cross. The finishing blow impacted with Mr. 4's skull, and the man's eyes finally rolled back into his head as he toppled over onto the sand with a loud thud, leaving the Strawat trio to collapse and pant in victory. Sanji leapt to the side to avoid another swipe of Mr. 1's bladed arms and quickly swept his legs out from under him. Ignoring the pain of his legs impacting with the steel, he took the opportunity to slam his heel against the man's skull before leaping back. He took a few seconds to catch his breath as Bentham swapped in and aimed a drop kick down on Mr. 1's torso, but the only slightly disoriented man rolled out of the way and crossed his arms as he got up before attempting to slash across the Akama's chest. Bentham ducked under the man's bladed arms and landed an uppercut to his chin, sending him reeling back, but Mr. 1 righted himself and headbutted him, which had a much greater effect given his steel body and larger mass. As Bentham was sent careening backwards, Sanji ran in and sidestepped a bladed kick from before launching into a flurry of kicks aimed at any body part other than the blade man's arms and legs. He finished with a mutton shot, kicking his opponent through a house onto the other side of the block. "I hope you don't think that'll be enough to keep him down," came the voice of Miss Doublefinger. The woman looked positively annoyed. Her hair was standing up on end, as if she had received some sort of electric shock, but Sanji wasn't sure how that could have happened. So this is Nami-san's new fighting style. I think I'm falling in love all over again. I'm not sure how, but it looks like she can turn invisible, so I don't have to worry about her for the time being. I better focus on the steel guy for now. I can't kick that spiky woman anyway. Thus, Sanji was forced to dodge numerous attempts to maim him through the use of the woman's bodily spikes. Bentham evidently realized he wasn't attacking. Hey, what are playing at Spiral Cook? She just left a few openings for you, in case you didn't notice. Shut it, you shitty ballerina. I won't kick a woman. I'd rather die. He shouted in response as he continued dodging. Miss Doublefinger raised an amused eyebrow at his bold statement. Then you shall. She claimed as she turned both her hands as well as her head into spiked balls. She started swinging at him rapidly, throwing in kicks of her own with her spiked heels, but Sanji simply kept dodging her, playing a purely evasive game. She was started to grow annoyed as it became more and more apparent that she couldn't land a hit. It was then that she felt a sense of déjà vu as the air around her grew warmer and then colder moments afterwards. She looked up and noticed a cloud, much like the one that had shocked her earlier. She gritted her teeth as she looked around for her assailant again, with limited success. She did, however, find where the source of the atmospheric disturbances were coming from, seeing as they were visible and quite conspicuous. Seeing this, she ran towards the location where the red and blue orbs were originating from. You won't fool me so easily a second time. She shouted in contempt. Nami-san. Sanji shouted in worry, but soon found himself preoccupied as Mr. One joined the fray again. Miss Doublefinger froze mid-stride, however, as Nami suddenly materialized off to the side, smirking. What? She's over there? So it was a diversion. She immediately altered her course off to the side, just as Nami brought her staff up. Blue lightning sparked in the cloud overhead, ready to strike. Sanji and Bentham watched in horror as Miss Doublefinger's spiked fist impaled Nami's skull. Only for her skull to fade into a haze around the limb. What? Miss Doublefinger exclaimed as she turned back to the spot she had previously been running to. Fooled you, Nami said, sticking her tongue out as the lightning struck her opponent, who screamed in pain. She struggled to keep herself upright after being struck by lightning for the second time that day. But Nami wasn't done yet. Beware of twisters. She shouted as she ran towards her opponent, staff at the ready. Tornado tempo. Miss Doublefinger watched wearily as fake birds popped out of the staff, which didn't seem to shake Nami's confidence in the slightest. Is that it? Miss Doublefinger yelled, getting ready to spear her through. But she was unable to move her arms as the wired birds wrapped around her arms and legs. The end section of the staff started spinning, lifted her off of her feet. She lost all orientation as she spun faster and faster, until suddenly she was launched through a building and came out the other side, much the same way Mr. One had been sent hurtling earlier. Only she lacked the defense that came with his devil fruit and was already on her last ropes. Landed on the other side of the partly demolished house, she didn't rise again. Mr. One watched in anger as his partner was defeated. You bitch, he hissed as he broke away from Sanji, who was panting from his constant hit and run tactics with the blade man. Nami's eyes widened as Mr. One ran towards him. Not good. My time limit for Mirage Tempo is up, Thunderbolt Tempo needs time to charge, and Tornado Tempo is a one-time deal. She could do nothing but raise her cleam attack in a poor attempt to ward off his bladed limbs as Sanji struggled to get there in time. She suddenly felt herself being pushed out of the way, however, and she landed roughly on the ground. She looked up to the horrifying sight of Bentham bleeding heavily, having been impaled by Mr. One's arm. She covered her mouth in shock. I told you, didn't I? Mr. One said in a low tone. This was bound to happen, one way or another, Mr. Two. He tossed Mr. Two off of his arm like a rag doll, and the Akama landed in a heap on the side of the road. Or whatever you call yourself now. He moved in to land the finishing blow, but his arm was stopped abruptly before it could meet its target. Sanji's leg, raised in a block, bled profusely as he held Mr.1 at bay. The officer agent gritted his teeth as he attempted to force Sanji out of the way, but despite the pain he must have been in, Sanji wouldn't budge. He simply glared at his opponent before redirecting his blow to the side and roundhouse kicking him across the street. Nami took the time to look over Bentham. He had managed to avoid a fatal injury, but he was still bleeding heavily. They needed to get him help, and fast. Sanji quickly jumped into the air above Mr. One as the man fell, ignoring the blood seeping from his leg with every movement, and spun in a vertical circle, before finally bringing his good heel crashing down on the agent's face. Concass. He leapt back again as Mr. One got up, slightly unsteadily. The blade man raised one hand to the bridge of his nose and brought it down. Blood. Realizing his nose was broken, he did what no one would expect. He grinned at Sanji. It's been a while since an enemy has drawn blood from me. I suppose I should thank you for the thrill of a decent fight, he said. Sanji said nothing in response. I have to finish this. The Akama needs medical treatment and this guy is insanely strong. I wouldn't have even made it this far if not the training I've been putting myself through. He braced himself as his opponent's arms morphed into what looked like buzzsaws. He really didn't want to get hit by those. The two charged at each other and Sanji leapt over him, kicking his head towards the pavement. He landed behind him and kicked him in the side before he could get up, sending him hurtling down the street before he righted himself, grunting. Sanji followed up, delivering a hail of kicks to the agent's head, neck, and torso. Anywhere that he wouldn't injure himself by kicking once his opponent turned into a blade. He had noticed early on in the fight that his entire body couldn't turn into a blade edge. Blades had two edges and two blunt sides, after all. Mutton shot. He shouted as he thrust his leg forward. Mr. One was prepared and took the hit, groaning as he slid back on his feet. Suddenly, they heard another crackle of thunder overhead, causing them both to look up. Another cloud had formed above Mr. One's head, causing Sanji's eyes to widen. "Nami-san, don't," he shouted. It was too late though. Thunderbolt tempo. The lightning came crashing down on Mr. One as Sanji shielded his eyes. When it cleared, Mr. One was still standing. Sparks of electricity emanated from his body. He looked downright pissed, but otherwise unaffected. Nami's eyes widened in realization. He's a conductor. Mr. One launched himself towards Nami. Sanji tried to follow after him, but his leg chose that moment to fail him and he dropped to one knee. Shit. Not now. He thought frantically. Nami's staff was knocked out of her hand, a bladed arm. She ducked to avoid another jab but fell over onto the ground in the process. She barely had time to move her head to avoid the next attack, but her shoulder was pierced instead, pinning her to the ground and eliciting a high-pitched scream. "This is what happens when you play with toys on the battlefield," Mr. One said emotionlessly. He was about to pierce her skull when he was sent crashing into a house for what felt like the 10th time that day. Only each time it was gradually getting more painful. As he picked himself up out of the rubble, he could see why. The blonde-haired man had seemed to gain an extra surge of adrenaline and was now walking on towards him effortlessly, despite the injury to his leg. The glare Mr. One was faced with threatened to burn a hole through him. "You have spirit, I'll give you that," Mr. One said. "But your kicks aren't enough to stop me. Anyone can see that you're wearing down." Sanji stopped in front of him before responding. "You're right. I haven't been good enough." But he bit his cigarette in half. "I'm a bit heated up now." To Mr. One's bewilderment, he started rapidly spinning in a circle with his leg raised, fast enough that he was a complete blur. When he stopped, his previously black leg was glowing orange, as if it had just been dipped into a furnace, except the leg itself didn't seem to be burning. Cooking is a gift from the gods. Spices are a gift from the devil. He lunged towards Mr. One. "Have a taste." The officer agent tried to block the blow by crossing his arms, but Sanji anticipated the move and his foot connected with his stomach anyway, the pressure from the kick driving a searing heat throughout his conductive body. He moaned in pain and stumbled backwards, clutching his abdomen, which gave Sanji an opening to land another kick across his face. He felt like his skull was aflame. Sanji thought back to his conversation with Zoro prior to their arrival in Alabasta. This technique will help you penetrate some of the toughest defenses, but it will also damage your body greatly until you master it. Try not to use it too much until you toughen up some more. The stress on your legs could cost you the fight if you don't end it quickly. Wasting no time, Sanji ducked under Mr. One's defense and got ready to finish it. Glamour. Anti-manner kick course. Mr. One was launched up into the air by Sanji's leg and howled in pain, but Sanji wasn't done yet. He jumped up into the air above Mr. One. Working past the pain, the blade man took the chance to launch one last counterattack. Atomic dicer. Two large gashes appeared across Sanji's chest as he raised his leg, but he roared with determination and brought it down. Glamour. Reception. His leg jutted straight down into Mr. One's already damaged torso, and the blade man's defense shattered along with his ribs as he was sent crashing back down to the pavement below. Sanji landed in front of him, panting heavily. His leg shifted back to its normal shade of black as he lit another cigarette. "Guess it was a little too spicy for you," he muttered, before promptly collapsing onto the ground. "Sanji-kun," came Nami's worried voice as she ran towards him. "Nami-san," Sanji crowed weakly. "Did you fall in love with me even more?" Nami sighed. "Sure, why not? Good job out there." She helped him to his feet, which instantly caused his eyes to be replaced by hearts. "But we have to get Bentham out of here and I'm not sure if I can carry you both," she said. "Do you think you can walk?" Sanji's face was slightly downcast as he trudged over to the Akama. "Right, I'll carry him," he said, causing Nami to look after him worriedly. "Are you sure?" Your injuries are worse than mine, but this only caused Sanji to go off on a hopeless rant about how he could never stand by and watch a lady do the heavy lifting as he hoisted Bentham onto his shoulder, careful not to aggravate the wound further. Eventually Nami just sighed and relented, following beside him. 3:55 p.m, Alabasta. Ishigi rushed to keep up with Captain Smoker as he glided across rooftops using his devil fruit. They only had 5 minutes before the bomb was fired. They had to get to the clock tower quickly. As the building came within sight, Tashigi noted that it would take time for her to actually get to the top, but Smoker could simply glide all the way up. Tashigi. The smoke man yelled. I'm going to give you a boost. Right. She consented before grabbing hold of her superior's hand. Smoker wasted no time and took them both straight to the top just as the clock, which turned out to be a door, opened to reveal two eccentrically dressed agents carrying pistols and laughing. Behind them, Tashigi could see the cannon that they were going to use to fire the bomb. They stopped laughing when they caught sight of the two Marines flying towards them and started shooting. Smoker evaded the shots, but as they drew closer, Tashigi took note of the match in one of the agent's hands. Smoker saw the same thing and threw Tashigi into the clock tower just the fuse was lit. Tashigi quickly drew her sword and incapacitated the two agents before turning to the fuse and severing it. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, but it caught in her throat as she heard the ticking coming from the bomb. Realizing what was happening immediately, Tashigi turned to Smoker, who had just landed beside her. Smoker-san, the bomb is timed. She yelled frantically. Smoker froze as he came to the same conclusion. He seemed to think for a moment before he walked toward the opening of the cannon. Only one thing to do then, he muttered. In an impressive show of strength, he pulled the bomb out of the muzzle and hoisted it over his shoulder. Tashigi's eyes widened. Smoker-san, what are you? But Smoker had already jumped out of the tower and was rising into the air, carrying the bomb with him. It was with horror that Tashigi realized what he was going to do. She screamed after him as he flew higher and higher, the bomb ticking away all the while. It was only when Smoker was far too high to hear her desperate shouts any longer that the bomb detonated and she had to cover her eyes to shield them from the blinding light of the explosion that seemed to block out the sky. When the sky cleared, Tashigi just stared up at it numbly, not believing what had just happened. When it finally sank in, she dropped to her knees, tears flowing down her cheeks. Sobs racked her body as she wondered how he could just leave like that, without so much as a farewell. No, how could he leave her at all? What was he thinking? What are you crying about? A voice asked from behind her. Do you call yourself a Marine, you over-emotional klutz of a girl? Tashigi froze, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. She slowly turned around towards the source of the all-too-familiar voice to face Captain Smoker, standing there without a scratch on him. Captain, she said numbly. What? Smoker asked in annoyance. You do know I'm a Loja, right? What the hell did you expect to happen? But Tashigi just tackled him in a hug, ignoring his indignant protests and half-hearted threats. Desert sword. Crocodile shouted as a long fissure appeared in the sand below Luffy's feet, prompting him to jump over it to avoid being speared and falling in. He quickly readied his own assault as his blackened fist twisted behind him. Gum ape rifle. The blow was dodged by the Sandman, who dispersed into sand a fraction of a second before it connected. Crocodile reformed in front of Luffy and tried to gut him with his poison hook, but Luffy deflected it with his hockey-imbued hand. He grabbed the Warlord by the arm and swung him over his shoulder into the air. Crocodile barely had enough time to right himself before Luffy was in front of him again, his arms reared back, ready to strike. Gum pan bazooka. His attack hit dead on this time, sending Crocodile through the air like a rag doll, before he rolled to a stop on the sand below. He quickly recovered and stood up. Luffy knew that fighting Crocodile in the desert would be no walk in the park. His victory last time had been due to a combination of luck and overconfidence on the Loja's part. Through sheer circumstance, he had discovered Crocodile's weakness and had been able to exploit it. But it wasn't until he had seen the former Warlord in action during the War of the Best that he had realized just how effective that weakness had been. Coming into contact with water didn't just prevent Crocodile from turning into sand, it weakened his body significantly. If it hadn't been for that factor, Luffy knew that for all he had gone through in Alabasta, he never would have kept the New World veteran down for long. But every time Luffy had utilized water in his assaults, he had chipped away at Crocodile's endurance and stamina until their encounter in the Royal Tomb, where the Warlord had been fighting at a small fraction of his usual ability. Even so, he had lost twice before pulling off a victory. Sometimes, looking back, he wondered if luck was actually a matter of innate talent rather than probability. Was he just good at being lucky? Even now he knew he had to be careful. His resistance to poison had not reverted back to his younger body as far as he knew, and he wasn't willing to find out the hard way. And then there was that whole dry you up with a single touch thing. Croc's fruit is stupid, he decided. He was broken out of his musings as the sand beneath his feet gave away. Desert sunflower. Crocodile growled as Luffy jumped into the air and used Geppu to escape the range of the sinkhole. Not just Haki, but Rakishiki too. Who is this rookie? His body dissolved into sand again as he attempted to intercept the rubber man in midair. Desert crescent. Luffy ducked under the crescent-shaped blade of sand and aimed to kick a crocodile. The Sandman grunted as he blocked with his forearm before dematerializing and reforming behind Luffy. Sables, he said as he caught the rookie in a miniature sandstorm. Luffy was blown back into the sinkhole that Crocodile had made and landed in, but as the Warlord tried to bury him, Luffy escaped with his air-walking technique again. Crocodile grimaced, realizing that his home field advantage was neutralized by the rubber man's mobility. He appeared behind him again and tried to impale him through the back, but Luffy twisted around the moment he materialized and redirected the jab. Gum Crocodile's eyes widened as Luffy's body started to steam again, and his obsidian black arms took on a familiar red tinge. Eagle Bazooka. The Sandman was launched back through the air and skidded along the desert sand, unable to right himself this time. He finally rolled to a stop and groaned as he picked himself up. He suddenly hunched over and coughed up a wad of blood. Before he could even recover, his opponent was in front of him again. Hawk rifle. The punch impacted with his face, and he was sent hurtling across the sand again. He struggled to get up, and for a split second, the world around him turned hazy before his vision cleared. No, he growled. Unacceptable. I will not be defeated, especially not by some run-of-the-mill rookie pirate. Luffy smirked at the statement and spread his arms out in open invitation. Crocodile almost charged again, but controlled himself. Instead, he channeled his focus into the environment, into the surrounding desert. The sand around them began to stir, and Luffy's eyes widened imperceptibly. Suddenly, the desert seemed to rise, as if awoken from its slumber. Waves of sand rose to incredible heights as the ground itself surrounded the two pirates before it came crashing down on them. Desert tsunami. Crocodile shouted with a dangerous grin on his face. Luffy did the one thing that would make sense in the situation, which was to use Geppu to ascend straight upwards, avoiding the tidal waves of sand. But Crocodile flew into the air after him, and the colossal waves followed behind as they took the fight to the sky. He never used this last time, Luffy thought. Then again, they had only fought in the desert once, and during that time, Crocodile had controlled the fight with ease, to the point where he probably had no need to. Suddenly, Luffy paled, having realized that he'd forgotten about Robin. In his haste to end the fight, Crocodile had done the same. Luffy quickly locked onto her with his observation haki. He sighed in relief as he noted that she had managed to take refuge on top of one of the buildings, but the sand was still rising, and would reach her soon. In fact, if this kept up, the civilians in Alabasta could be in danger as well. He had to end this quickly. As Crocodile ascended towards him, Luffy used Geppu to speed up his own descent. His haki-imbued arm stretched out behind him, taking on red tinge and then erupting into flame. Gum Crocodile ignored this new development as he readied his own assault. The widespread waves of sand surrounding him took on the shape of giant blades as they were launched up at Luffy. Desert rapier. Crocodile shouted just as Luffy brought his arms down. Red Hawk cannon. His armaments and flame-enhanced arms pierced through the sand like a hot knife through butter. His fists made contact with Crocodile's abdomen, resulting in a massive explosion that sent the Warlord hurtling down towards the ground. The impact caused widespread destruction across the city block, and a couple of buildings collapsed, even as the previously rising waves of sand started to recede. Luffy landed smoothly in front of the bloody, burnt, and unconscious heap that was Sir Crocodile of the Seven Warlords. He reached for the hat that was now dangling around his neck and placed it back on his head. Off to the side, he heard Robin jump down from the building she had taken refuge on and land with a soft thud. She stared at Crocodile in shock. Which was understandable. It wasn't every day a rookie from East Blue took out a royal warlord without so much as a scratch to show for it. Luffy then turned towards Robin, who stiffened. He took a few steps toward her, but stopped when she took a step back and crossed her arms. He raised his arms in a placating manner. Relax. I'm not going to attack you. Clearly she didn't believe him. Luffy winced as fear rolled off of her in waves. She was good at hiding it. Outwardly, she actually looked calm, save for her rigid posture, but Luffy's observation haki didn't lie. Suddenly, Robin let out a breath before slowly lowering her arms to her sides. Her eyes lowered along with them, refusing to meet Luffy's. Her posture was defeated and her smile bitter. I'm on the losing side of this game, she recited. So it would appear. There was an abundance of things that Luffy wanted to do at that moment. This was Robin. Crewmate, comrade, friend. Family. He wanted to comfort her and tell her to hang in there. He wanted to run up to her, grab her by the shoulders, and scream at her, telling her she wasn't alone. In the end, he settled for the next best thing. That depends which side you're playing on. You haven't lost just yet. Robin looked up and met his eyes and was confused by what she saw in them. It wasn't hate or scorn or even disappointment. She could pick up on such emotions with a single glance. But this was different. The look in his eyes was familiar, but it was something she hadn't seen in so long that she almost forgot what it looked like. She almost found herself wishing he would glare at her like everyone else. That way she'd be in familiar territory. But a small voice in her mind, a part that had long been silenced, suddenly spoke up for the first time in years, telling her that this was better. She suddenly laughed, dryly, humorlessly, and yet somehow still melodically, as she considered his words. I don't think there's a winning side for me, Monkey D. Luffy. Well then, Luffy said, before a grin stretched across his face. I'll just have to prove you wrong. Robin stared at him in open curiosity. Not many have accomplished such a feat. Luffy's grin turned amused as he wordlessly pointed toward Crocodile's fallen, defeated form. And I'm guessing that's a first too. Robin blinked, and a small, amused chuckle escaped her lips despite her efforts to contain it, which caused Luffy's grin to widen. See? That's much better, he said cryptically. Robin stiffened, having caught herself, and her mask fell back in place. Luffy pouted internally. What's better? Robin asked in slight confusion. Your real laugh. I like it. It's much better than that fake smile you put on. Robin was silent for a moment. Someone once told me that a fake laugh is better than no laugh at all, she finally said. Well crap, Luffy thought. Robin had told him the story of Jaguar D. Sol once. He had listened very intently to every detail, and this was paraphrasing at its finest. Then I'll just have to make you laugh for real from now on, he replied. Don't worry, I'll be able to tell the difference. Robin's eyes widened, but then narrowed. What are you planning, Monkey D. Luffy? She asked in suspicion. At that moment, it was all Luffy could do to keep the hurt from entering his features. He quickly recovered. That's a tough question, he answered. I'm not really a planner, you see. But to give you the quick rundown, I'm planning to hand Croc over to Smokey and meet up with the rest of the crew. Then you'll become our crewmate and we'll escape from the Marines, go on lots of adventures, piss off the world government a bit, make it through the Grand Line, and find One Piece. I'll leave the details to you since you seem good at that. Robin was well and surely dumbfounded. She had received many invitations to various organizations in the past, but never in such a manner. She didn't know whether to laugh or run. The man whose comrade she had wronged on so many levels was offering him a position in his crew, and he seemed sincere. Almost like he had no ulterior motive. She felt like there was danger, but she couldn't see it. His posture was relaxed, even friendly, as she stared at her, waiting for her to respond. It was as if he was indeed speaking to someone he considered a friend. There was no pity in his eyes. He wasn't acting like he expected her to flee, even if her experiences told her she should. Hell, he wasn't even expecting her to decline. He just kept looking at her with that childish, and yet somehow charismatic, her mind duly noted, smile of his, like she was already one of his crewmates, and he was having a casual conversation with a friend. Her mind screamed at her to rethink that, but that was exactly what it seemed like. This man he had no hostile intentions whatsoever. All these thoughts passed in the span of 5 seconds, and Luffy waited patiently as she took another 5 to consider his offer. Robin's life was a cycle of betrayals, each of which led her to the next betrayer. Such a life was tiring, but that life had taken her far and had ultimately led her here, to Crocodile, who would have been next in line. Would have been if not for this strange pirate who claimed he could break the cycle. But if her experiences were right, and they always were, then he would be a part of it, no matter what his intentions were right now. So why was she so tempted to accept? I'll have to think about this plan of yours, she whispered finally, taking a chance. Luffy shrugged. Suit yourself. Take all the time you need. It was ridiculous. It would never work. Eventually the darkness of her existence would come to shadow him and his little crew, and she would have to either betray him or be betrayed. But would that be so bad? Even Alabasta's poneglyph was a hopeless dream now. Her life had no longer had any purpose. She had seen with her own eyes the carefree nature of the Straw Hat Pirates. Maybe she could pretend she could live that life, just for a little while. Until things went downhill. Then would she finally accept her fate? Only time would tell. Well, for now, Luffy said, catching her attention. Let's go find your poneglyph. Robin's eyes widened. So you did know? Luffy smiled. I know a lot of things. Of course. He knew who I was ever since Whiskey Peak, and he knows about Pluton as well. That means he knows what I'm looking for. You don't seem like someone who would be interested in the poneglyphs, she said carefully. Your interests are mine, he said simply. Seeing her puzzled look, he elaborated. Now that I've invited you to the crew, I can't just disregard your goals, can I? It wasn't quite that she couldn't figure him out. It was just that she could barely believe he was real. You know what I'm after and you're willing to help me? She asked numbly. Well, I'm not exactly doing this for a history lesson, although it would be cool to know what happened. Robin felt a bead of sweat roll down her forehead as she let his words sink in. Could this really be happening? Could she still have a chance? Luffy's face suddenly turned solemn. But don't put all your hopes into this. You might not find what you're looking for. The words stung like ice in Robin's veins. He was right after all. Even if they could find it, she wasn't even sure that this was the Rio poneglyph. In fact, if she were to take an unbiased guess, she would say that it wasn't. But she was far from rational right now. This was her last lead, and if she didn't find what she was looking for. Luffy hid his guilt, knowing what the outcome of this would be, as he hoisted Crocodile over one shoulder. He walked up to Robin and tossed her over the other, ignoring her gasp of protest, before taking off in the direction of the royal palace, using Skywalk. When Luffy arrived back at the royal palace carrying an unconscious Crocodile and a resigned Robin over his shoulders, the Straw Hats that had gathered there already, namely Nami, Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, and Seal, all had varying reactions. Once Luffy landed, Usopp immediately started cheering. "Alright. You beat him, Luffy. I never doubted you for a second." Chopper chose to stare at Luffy in awe. "Luffy's so strong," he said quietly. Seal was especially enthusiastic, waving his arms in the air and somehow jumping up and down, despite lack of the necessary appendages with which to do so. Although he didn't really know who Crocodile was, he'd been able to piece together that he was the leader of the ones who the crew was at conflict with and therefore recognized this as a victory. Nami, on the other hand, decided to focus on the fact that the one she knew as Miss All Sunday was still conscious and was now moving of her own free will. "Luffy," she yelled in panic. "What is Miss All Sunday doing here?" Meanwhile, Sanji was staring at Robin with glazed over eyes as if mesmerized. Luffy scratched his head. "Huh? What do you mean? She's here because she wants to be." "That's not what I meant," Nami yelled, waving her fist. "I meant, why did you bring her here unrestrained?" Luffy's face lit up in comprehension. "Ooh, okay, I get it." He then turned to King Cobra, who, having caught on to who she was watching Robin nervously, along with Pell and Chaka. "So anyway, King Asen, can you?" "Don't ignore my question," Nami shouted indignantly. If she hadn't been terrified of the warlord at his feet, she probably would have gone to bonk him over the head by now. As it was, she was hiding behind Sanji while shouting. "If I may interrupt," Robin began, "I've already surrendered to your captain, and even if I wanted to, it's not likely that I could do much of anything with him here. So you really have nothing to fear from me," she pointed out. Nami was still staring at her suspiciously though. "Don't worry about it, Nami," Luffy said dismissively. "I trust her. She won't try anything." "Monkey-san," Robin spoke up, addressing Luffy. All eyes turned to her and she closed her eyes. What she was about to tell them could change everything. "Since you're helping me, I thought you should know the princess's friends from the rebel army were being held in Rain Base." She looked down at the ground. "Though to be honest, I don't think they're still taken care of," Luffy said. Robin looked surprised and Luffy grinned. "I sent Zoro to help Vivi retrieve them. They'll be back soon." Robin looked at him somewhat guiltily. "I'm not certain they'll be able to help," she stated. "I am," Luffy said with a tone of finality. His sheer confidence surprised her, but she supposed she shouldn't be shocked. He had been this way from the beginning. "Luffy," Nami began uncertainly, "what does she mean when she says you're helping her?" "Right, I was getting to that. But you guys kept interrupting me," Luffy said with a pout. He turned back to the king. "Hey King Asen, can you let Robin see the poneglyph you guys are protecting?" As soon as the words left his mouth, Cobra's eyes widened considerably, while Pell and Chaka looked at him in confusion. When the king got past his shock, a bead of sweat rolled down his brow. "Not to come off as rude, but how do you know about that exactly?" he asked carefully. Luffy sighed melodramatically. "Why does everyone keep asking that?" he said, looking around at everyone present. "For the last time, I know a lot of things. So? Can we see it?" Cobra looked uncertain as he snuck a glance at Robin, which neither she nor Luffy missed. "I cannot express how grateful I am that you've saved this country, but I'm not sure that would be a good idea. That stone is kept secret for a reason. It is guarded by the Alabastan royal family so as not to fall into the wrong hands." As he spoke, Robin tensed up. Luffy hummed in thought. Then he did something no one expected. He took his hat off and placed it over his heart while still facing the king. "King Cobra, I swear on this hat as well as my life that neither I nor Nico Robin will do anything to risk the safety of your country or the world using anything we find under your guidance." He bowed his head. "I ask you, not as the savior of this country, but as the captain of the Straw Hat Pirates and VV's comrade, to grant our request." Everyone present now stared at him with wide eyes, but none were as shocked as Robin. The king's eyes had widened imperceptibly at the name Nico Robin, but now he simply stared at Luffy with an unreadable expression as Robin waited with bated breath. After a few moments, it was his turn to surprise everyone. He bowed low to the ground, much to the slight exasperation of Pell and Chaka, and spoke. "I acknowledge your goodwill, young one, and I will grant your request," he said, causing Luffy to grin widely. Meanwhile, Usopp turned to Nami. "Do you have any idea what's going on here?" he asked quietly. Nami, being just as lost as he was, shrugged. Sanji watched the exchange with open interest. His gaze was now on Robin again, but there was no trace of lust in his eyes now. He looked as if he was trying to piece together a puzzle. Eventually, he just shrugged, figuring it was none of his business anyway. As Cobra led them to the underground tomb, Robin turned to Luffy. "Thank you," she whispered. Luffy just grinned again and flashed her a thumbs up. As they were about to leave, however, they were interrupted by the arrival of Smoker and Tashigi. While the latter was rather shocked once she laid eyes on Crocodile's fallen form, the former just glanced at him disinterestedly before turning back to Luffy. "So you really did beat Crocodile," he commented. Luffy nodded. "And you guys stopped the bomb," he acknowledged. "Do you have any sea stone handcuffs by any chance?" Smoker motioned to Tashigi, who had a pair ready. As she walked towards the fallen warlord, Smoker turned back to Luffy. "I still have some questions for you, Straw Hat." Luffy shrugged. "Fine with me," he said, before turning to Robin. "Give me a minute." She nodded in consent and Luffy walked off, following behind Smoker. As they left, the king turned towards her. "Your name was Nico Robin, wasn't it?" he asked. Without facing him, Robin closed her eyes and nodded. The king was silent for a moment. "And am I correct in assuming that you can read the ancient language of the poneglyphs?" Robin sighed tiredly and nodded again. "Then what I am about to do will not only disgrace the efforts of my predecessors, but put the very balance of our world at great risk. Still, I owe that man a great debt, not just as the king of the country he brought salvation to, but also as the father of the girl he aided. So seeing as I trust his judgment, I will fulfill my promise." Robin said nothing in response. "So? What did you want to ask me?" Luffy asked casually once the two were alone. "Don't pretend you don't know," Smoker said impatiently. "Why not? It's more fun for me that way," Luffy said with a straight face. This caused Smoker to growl, and Luffy smiled widely. "Lighten up, Smokey. First of all, how long are you going to keep calling me that?" the Smoke Man asked in annoyance. "Until I'm dead," Luffy replied. "Okay, next question." Controlling his temper, Smoker sighed and looked Luffy dead in the eye. "Why didn't you kill me, Straw Hat?" "What do you mean by that?" Luffy asked. "Don't play dumb with me. Not once, but twice, you defeated me, and both times you let me live. I want to know why." Luffy didn't answer for a moment as he stared at Smoker with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke. "How many people have you killed, Smokey?" Smoker's eyes narrowed. "What does that have to do with it?" he asked. "Humor me." Smoker hesitated for a moment. 21, he answered finally. "Sometimes they had hostages and had to be dealt with quickly. Other times I had orders to kill. The rest," he trailed off. "The rest did things that I couldn't find it in myself to forgive. They don't always sit there and wait to be arrested, Straw Hat. But you should know that." "But you haven't lost count," Luffy pointed out. "You haven't forgotten about them, even the ones that you thought deserved it." "No, and I'll cut my stomach open the day I do," Smoker growled impatiently. "Now what's the point of this?" "The point is that you need a legitimate reason to kill someone," Luffy said. "So what makes you think I'm any different?" There was an underlying tone of anger in his voice now. "What have I ever done that makes you think I need a reason to not kill someone?" Smoker found he had no answer to that, and Luffy continued. "You ask me why I let you live. My question is, why do you need my permission to live? A life isn't something I have rights to unless it's my own, and it's not something I'll take away just for the hell of it." There was a long pause. "That's all well and good," Smoker said, his voice slightly more subdued now. "But I hope you know that the rest of the world doesn't share your sentiments. With a bounty like yours, if I had captured you before, you'd be dead by now, or worse." Luffy shrugged. "That's your choice," he said as if it was inconsequential. "And I know what the world is like. Believe me, I know." Robin tried to stifle her anxiety as Luffy and Smoker made their way back. It wasn't in her nature to be impatient, but this was a rare moment when she couldn't help it. Her 20 years of searching had come down to this. But despite how she felt, she knew she had no right to rush her strange benefactor. Even disregarding the fact that she was in no position to do so. "Ready, Robin?" said Man asked with a grin as he walked up to her. She suppressed her initial reaction upon once again being addressed by her first name as she nodded. She was slowly getting used to it due to Straw Hat Luffy's general aura of ambiguity, if nothing else, but it still surprised her enough that she had to keep herself from showing it. Once Cobra led them to the courtyard, Robin wasn't surprised to see him activate an underground stairwell that no doubt led to what she was seeking. She had suspected that it would be near the palace. Anyone could find it if it was inside the building itself, so that was out. That left underground. As they descended the steps, Robin felt her heart beat faster and faster. She was finding it more difficult to steal her emotions by the second as her mantra of hope repeated itself within her head over and over. This could be it. This could be it. This could be it. When she caught sight of the stone and her mind started processing the inscriptions, the first thing she felt was denial. It made sense for the poneglyph to at least mention the ancient weapon. She had long concluded that it was a topic relevant to the void century. But as she kept reading, her denial, short-lived as it was also not in her nature, melted and gave way to nervousness, then desperation, and as she read the last words, grief. It revealed the location of the ancient weapon, Pluton. Nothing else was inscribed. She had failed. She had failed Professor Clover and her mother and all of O'Hara. She was a disgrace, the name of the last O'Haran. Tears flowed down her cheeks as her long-lived shell of protective indifference came crashing down. She paid no heed to the bewilderment on King Cobra's face as he watched her shameful display. It didn't matter anymore. She suddenly felt a hand grasp her shoulder and she turned to face the sad eyes of Monkey D. Luffy. "Why are you crying, Robin?" he asked gently. It was strange, she reflected. A barrier 20 years in development and it been shattered so easily. For so long she had hidden her anger, frustration, grief, and every other genuine emotion she felt in order to survive. Now, here she was, crying in defeat in front of the embodiment of her unreachable dream as her former enemy attempted to console her. Whatever other twists life had to throw at her, she didn't want to see them. She was tired. She was so sick and tired of it all. Enough. No more. This was the end of the line. "Robin," Luffy said, a little more forcefully. She looked back at him. "I don't think you understand. This was my last lead. I have nothing else to keep me going." She was silent for a moment. 20 years, she reflected bitterly. I lied. I killed. I betrayed. And for what? A beacon of false hope. "Is that what you think it is?" Luffy asked. "What you're seeing as false hope, you should really be seeing as hope in disguise. You let doubt sway you, convincing yourself that this was your last chance, when you really should be asking yourself where you need to go from here. Tell yourself that you have to work harder than you ever have before, but don't ever tell yourself that it's over. Accept that it's not going to be easy, but don't ever give up. If you keep going like that, one day, you'll find what you're seeking. That, and more than you could ever hope for." Robin covered her eyes with her hand. "You don't get it. I can't keep going like this." "Maybe not," Luffy agreed. "Not alone." Robin looked up at him and was once again taken aback by the endless conviction in his eyes. Why was he so committed to her cause? "Excuse me," Cobra interrupted. "But is this not what you were looking for?" he asked. "No," Luffy answered. "This one tells the location of an ancient weapon." Cobra nodded. "That knowledge has been passed down through the Alabastian royal family, but even we don't know the location. No one in the world did until now." Luffy didn't really see the point in correcting him, so he said nothing. "But then, what is she searching for?" Cobra asked, motioning to Robin. "The Rio poneglyph," she answered. "The one that tells the true history of the void century 800 years ago." Cobra's eyes widened. "Are you saying that the threads of that ancient history can be woven together? But then the bounty of 79 million, why was such a large price placed on your head? It was my understanding that you intended to reawaken those weapons, yet your goal is the pursuit of knowledge." "The world government doesn't care what her intentions are," Luffy responded. "As long as she can read the ancient language, they view her as a threat. In fact, I'd appreciate it if you kept this meeting a secret. It would be bad if they found out she knows the location of Pluton." Cobra nodded without hesitation as he looked at Robin in a new light. Said woman was still staring at Luffy. She seemed like she was struggling to come to a decision about something. She opened her mouth momentarily and then closed it. "It still stands," he said knowingly. "My offer for you to join us." She was silent for a long while. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she finally admitted. "I have no home." He stared at her intently. "Let's change that." The rebel army had been pacified. Upon waking up, they had all assumed that they had fallen under attack and resumed the invasion of Alabasta. But before they had arrived at the palace, they had been confronted by Koza, who had briefly gone missing again. But that wasn't the surprising part. He was being accompanied by 3 people. One was a mysterious stranger with green hair and 3 swords. One was Princess VV, who had been missing for 2 years. The last one was Kibi, who Koza previously claimed he had seen die. This had demanded an explanation. And did they ever get one? Koza and VV had explained everything right then and there. From what had really happened with the dance powder 2 years ago, to how Koza had been impersonated by a devil fruit user, and finally who was behind it all. After that, Koza had personally ordered them to drop their weapons and surrender to the royal army. While the vast majority had done exactly that, a select few within the crowd had drawn their guns and fired at Koza, much to the shock of everyone there. But even more shocking was the unknown swordsman that had intercepted the gunfire and incapacitated the shooters within seconds. Upon further inspection they were all seen to be adorning the same mark, which Koza and Kibi testified was the mark of the underground criminal organization run by Crocodile. The unconscious perpetrators had been apprehended on the spot. Now, the rebel and royal soldiers alike stared in wonder as Koza bowed low in front of the king as a sign of renewed loyalty. What happened next came as a shock to everyone. King Cobra didn't even hesitate before offering him a place in his personal guard, claiming that it was a chance for him to redeem himself. But most saw it for what it was, a gesture of forgiveness and even trust. But the really shocking part came next. Cobra had announced that the group that had taken down Crocodile and the rest of Baroque works, in other words, Alabasta saviors, was a group of pirates led by Straw Hat Luffy. Upon becoming the center of attention, said pirate had looked slightly uncomfortable and very annoyed, and eventually the king and princess had ushered their crew into the palace. But not before the press got wind of the situation and obtained a story that would make the headlines of Alabasta's newspaper. Needless to say, Alubarna was in a state of chaos. And that was before the rain started falling. The silence in the room was suffocating. Although it was quite cramped in the infirmary of the royal palace, one could be claustrophobic and not even give it a second thought, as whatever discomfort the lack of space induced was dwarfed by the scene in front of them. The doctors were visibly distracted from the work they were supposed to be doing as they observed the conspicuous evidence of bad blood in the palace. Vivi didn't blare often. She was much too reserved and polite most of the time. But there was no mistaking the scowl on her face as she refused to pull her distrustful eyes away from Robin, who had been ignoring the hostility since Vivi had first seen her in the palace. Luffy wasn't really sure what to do in this situation. He sighed and then he turned towards Zoro and gave him a meaningful look. It was one that Zoro had seen before, one that always meant one thing. Zoro, cut it, was his captain's order. But he wasn't exactly sure what to do with the command right now. He looked at Luffy quizzically. Cut what? Luffy motioned to Vivi and Robin in response. Detention. Zoro rolled his eyes. You're an idiot, he conveyed back. Luffy pouted childishly. Finally, Robin sighed and turned towards Vivi, looking into her eyes unflinchingly. If you think glaring will allow you to rid yourself of my existence, believe me, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Vivi didn't respond, and although the room remained silent, Luffy winced upon hearing the words, and Zoro stiffened as well. Finally, Vivi spoke, albeit briefly. Where's Igaram? She asked quietly. Robin looked like she just wanted the day to be over, but she answered the question. I set up the bomb so that the explosions wouldn't reach him, she explained. I left him a log pose, so he should make it back soon. But I can only guess when. Vivi's eyes were narrowed, but she turned away from Robin to face Luffy. Luffy-san, why is she still here? She asked simply. Many people put in the same position would have hesitated to answer. But Luffy was not one of them. She's going to join our crew, he replied. The crew's reactions varied. Although Seal seemed indifferent, Usopp and Chopper fell over in shock, Nami looked like she wanted to protest, Sanji looked like he wanted to celebrate, but suppressed the urge for the sake of sensitivity, and Zoro just kept a blank face through it all. Robin, who was subtly observing them all, was slightly taken aback at seeing the lack of surprise on the swordsman's face. But the most profound reaction was Vivi's. Her eyes had widened, and her mouth was agape as she looked back and forth between Luffy and Robin, wondering if she had heard right. Finally, her objection came. Luffy-san, you can't be serious. How can you trust her so easily? She came close to shouting. Because she's already proven herself, he said simply. With her power, she could have helped Crocodile kill me, but she didn't. Robin stared at him curiously. You really couldn't have gotten out of that hold? She asked skeptically. I could have, Luffy admitted. But I wanted to see what you'd do. Robin nodded in understanding. That doesn't excuse what she's done, Vivi said. She worked for Crocodile and helped bring Alabasta to ruin. Am I just supposed to forgive and forget? You worked for Crocodile too, Luffy reminded her. And you tried to kill us. Vivi flinched upon hearing that, and Luffy continued. She had her reasons just like you. I won't ask you to forget. Not ever. But I will ask you to try and forgive. Vivi looked conflicted. Princess, Robin interrupted. I won't try to make excuses for what I did. I knew what the results of my actions would be, and yet I threw my morality to the wind. I hardened my heart for the sake of my own ambitions and condemned the world I thought had rejected me, and in the process, I almost destroyed millions of lives, including yours. I won't ask for your forgiveness. But all I want now is a chance to start over. She paused. I know I have no right celebrating with you. If you so wish, I will leave your home. but unless I'm kicked out, I do plan on joining the Straw Hat Pirates." Vivi was silent for a long time, but finally she let out a breath. "You can stay," she said quietly, before turning to Luffy. "And I'll try to forgive. For your sake." With that said, she walked out of the room. Robin watched her go with saddened eyes. Any protests that the rest of the crew had died down as well. They figured that if Vivi could accept Luffy's decision, then they had no right to go against it. "So how's Bentham doing?" Usopp asked in a subdued voice. The crew welcomed the change of subject. "He's still recuperating," Chopper replied. "He lost a lot of blood, so he could still be out of it for a while, but he'll be okay." "Well, that's good to hear," Sanji said. "Give him my thanks when he wakes up. We owe him one." Nami nodded in agreement with the statement. "So, how long do you think we have before the Marines come after us?" "We'll be safe here in the palace so long as no one tells them anything, but once we set out to sea, they'll be ready for us. We caused quite the commotion." "It will take some time for news of what occurred to get out," Robin commented. "But we shouldn't wait too long. The Marine captain who patrols these seas is called Black Cage Hina. She's famous for her organized assault formations. It would be best for someone to secure the ship you came with. Otherwise, I give it until tomorrow before it's taken." "That's assuming they'll be leaving this to their local enforcement," Zoro pointed out. "Unless I'm giving them too much credit, by now they'll already know that we're not in the same league as the Marines they have stationed in this part of the Grand Line." He was careful not to use the term paradise, since that was a word used by those who had seen what the New World was like. Even so, Robin still looked at him curiously. "You speak almost as though you've been through the Grand Line before," she said. Zoro thought back on his phrasing and inwardly sighed. She was right. He did make it sound that way. "No, but I know that the Marines probably won't take us lightly after this," he amended. "Crocodile was a lot stronger than any force they have stationed near Alabasta, and given our recent win streak, I wouldn't be surprised if Marine headquarters decided to take this into their own hands." Robin silently contemplated this for a moment. It wasn't that she didn't agree with his assessment. She did, fully. What she was wondering was how he arrived at that conclusion. How would he know the level of competency that the Marines in this area had if he had just arrived here a few days ago? She herself had been in this area for a while and knew that he was right. No Marines in these seas would be able to take on their captain from what she'd seen, and she had her suspicions about the first mate's prowess as well. In fact, even their chef would be more than a match for Captain Hina if his victory over Mr. One was any indication, but the reports had said that he didn't attack women. No, it wasn't his conclusion that she was curious about. It was the fact that he was so confident in it, despite his apparent lack of experience in the Grand Line. She suddenly felt an urge to question him about it, but circumstances led her to hold her tongue. Perhaps another time. She had questions for her new captain too, after all. "So then you think they'll most likely send a greater force to apprehend us," she said. She almost missed an invisible relaxing of his posture once her short silence ended. "Almost. Yay. I can't be sure, but we should be prepared for anything," he answered. She nodded. "Well, we can worry about that later," Luffy said. For now Robin looked at him in question, and he grinned widely. "Let's get this party started." After Bentham finally woke up, the celebrations began. The royal feast went as expected. At least from the perspective of the Straw Hats. The king and royal guards, however, were quite taken aback by their manner of consumption. While the king, to his credit, kept calm through it all, the royal guards had a hard time hiding their disgust. But as the feast continued, with the Straw Hat captain stealing food off of every single plate, including those of the king and princess, they noted, they couldn't help but become amused by the show, and they inevitably started laughing uncontrollably at the sight of the man who had defeated Sir Crocodile and saved the entire nation acting so down to earth. He certainly wasn't one for formalities, even in a palace of all places. While Nami, Usopp and Sanji were raging at Luffy, Chopper was marveling at how fast the food disappeared upon being set onto the table. Bentham and Seal, who Luffy had insisted they set a plate for, were cheering Luffy on, and Vivi was putting up with it with a resigned smile. Only 2 people were currently guarding their food semi-successfully. Zoro, being one of them, didn't seem to care that much, although he'd occasionally jab Luffy's outstretched hand with his fork. Robin, being the other, thanks in part to her powers, could only watch in fascination. They were all so carefree. They knew full well what was coming once they left the palace, and yet their greatest concern at the moment was keeping their food out of their captain's reach. Perhaps there was some credit due to them for living in the moment. Robin had never given much thought to the lifestyle, always looking ahead, thinking ahead, plotting ahead. She supposed she should be put off by their complete lack of forethought, but strangely, she wasn't. In fact, she almost found it endearing. As nonsensical as it was, she actually felt a light smile forming on her face as she watched their antics, even as she sprouted hands around her plate to keep the rubber man from snatching her food. She knew their type. They were reckless, impulsive, and prone to self-destructive actions that were made solely based on their emotions. She was quite the opposite. Maybe there really was some merit to the notion that opposites attract. She couldn't deny that their outlook on life had its appeal, after all. As she watched them, she could practically feel all the tension in her life start to subside. Ironically, that was what worried her the most. After the feast ended, the royal guards were in for another surprise. True to Robin's word, Igaram had arrived at the palace. When he asked for the status report in regard to Baroque works, assuming that VV would have at least passed on the message to the king, he was shocked to hear that Crocodile had been defeated by the Strawats. He did not hesitate to express his gratefulness, even if he was rather put off by the presence of Miss All Sunday, or rather, Nico Robin, as he was informed. After his arrival, the Strawats were invited to the royal bathhouse. As the king had somewhat come to expect, even bathing was made into a party by the mysterious little crew. Luffy and Usopp had raced toward the water and jumped right in, and were currently splashing each other relentlessly, Luffy being unaffected due to the water being shallow. Their shouts of certain death, Splash Star and Gum Gum Splash Gatling could be heard throughout the palace. As Zoro washed Chopper's back, Sanji walked over to Igaram with a devious look on his face. "So," he began casually, "where's the woman's bath?" "As if I would tell you, you damn lecher," he shouted. "Princess VV is in there." That was when King Cobra got up and made a show of pointing to its location. "It's right over that wall," he yelled. "Your Majesty, you bastard." Igaram raged. "Oh, I like your style, old man," Usopp commented as he almost everyone else strolled towards the wall. On the other side, Nami, Vivi, and Robin, who Nami and even Vivi were slowly warming up to, were discussing their adventures through the Grand Line so far. "I still can't believe we got to see dinosaurs and giants in one day," Vivi said in a nostalgic tone. "Yay, that was pretty crazy," Nami commented. "I didn't think we were going to make it off of that island alive, to be honest." To think of it, how did you all make it through Little Garden?" Robin asked. "As I recall, it takes a year for the log to set there." Nami smiled deviously. "Oh, I bet you'd like to know, wouldn't you, miss you wouldn't make it to Alabasta," she said in a teasing tone. Robin smiled lightly and nodded. "I would," she admitted. As Nami reminded her of the stunt Sanji had pulled, Robin couldn't help but feel impressed. They had played Crocodile for a fool, and even she hadn't realized it. She couldn't help but feel amused by the fact that they themselves had provided the Strawats with the means to make it here. "We'll have to thank Sanji-kun for that one again later," Nami said with a triumphant smile. Vivi nodded her agreement. "Well, why don't you tell him now? He's right over there after all," Robin said in an amused tone. Nami and Vivi followed where she was pointing and stared in shock at the sight of every man except Zoro and Bentham peeping on them. Vivi was horrified, but Nami just sighed. "You idiots," Nami muttered. "Alright, it'll be 10,000 biri each," she shouted before pulling off her robe, much to Vivi's continued horror and Robin's continued amusement. The reaction was instantaneous, they all fell off the wall that they had scaled in a mixture of shock and contentment. The only ones who didn't fall off were Chopper and Seal, who had went along with what everyone else was doing and now looked on in confusion, and Luffy, who burst out laughing. "Just put it on my tab, Nami," the pirate captain shouted before jumping down, being followed shortly by Chopper and Seal. "Idiots," Zoro grumbled, before turning to Bentham. "Well, at least you held yourself back," he complimented. Bentham quirked an eyebrow. "Oh, didn't you know? I'm gay. I'm fine right where I am. Ahaha." Zoro started scooting away from him as he continued laughing. Igaram cleared his throat as he wiped away his nosebleed. "How unsightly," he admonished. "Wow," Luffy said. "Our Sanji may be a pervert, but at least he's not in the closet about it." "Hypocrisy at its finest," Usopp agreed. "Shut up you damn brats. I only went to stop you all," Igaram yelled unconvincingly. "And a liar too," Sanji added. "At least Usopp is kind of good at it when he wants to be." "Thank you," King Cobra said, as blood dripped from his nose as well. "Dirty old man," the Strawats all said in unison. "Not for that," he yelled before lowering his head to the ground. "Thank you for saving the country I love," he said. Zoro grinned. "Is it okay for a king to be doing that?" he asked, although unlike Igaram, who voiced the same concern, he had no problem with it. "Rank and status is worn on one's clothing," the king recited. "There is no such thing as a naked king. So as a father and a citizen of this country, I would like to express my gratitude. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Luffy grinned widely. "Anytime." Smoker sighed tiredly as Tashigi walked towards him with the transponder snail. He really didn't feel like having this conversation. "Smoker-san, it's Captain Hina," the sergeant major reported dutifully. Smoker nodded in acknowledgement and took the transponder snail. "It's been a long time, Hina. To what do I owe the displeasure?" "You're as charming as ever, Smoker." That is to say, not at all. How I sympathize with Tashigi's troubles. Hina sympathizes. Did you call to make small talk? Smoker asked lazily. Hurry up and get to the point before our call gets intercepted by pirates. Hina was silent on the other line. They both knew that pirates intercepting marine calls was exceedingly rare, as not many had the knowledge and resources to successfully attempt it. Smoker was either paranoid or had an annoying sense of humor. Hina knew very well that both statements were true. Fine. I thought I should tell you that your report on the events that occurred in Alabasta wasn't exactly received well by HQ. Let me mention that Straw Hat Luffy was being considered for the position of Royal Warlord to replace Crocodile. Smoker grunted. That made sense. If they couldn't cover up the events, one way to save face was to make an ally out of the one who had toppled one of the 7 warlords. Not that he thought Straw Hat would have ever accepted. He asked. Does that mean they decided against it? If so, they'll be short one warlord. They didn't have much of a choice, Hina said. The decision had practically been made to offer him the position at first, until the most recent outrage occurred. Most recent outrage? What are you talking about? Smoker asked, feeling out of the loop. Oh, you haven't heard. You might want to pick up a global newspaper when you get the chance. I'd hate to spoil the surprise, after all. Smoker sighed. Fine. Anything else I should know? Actually, yes. I've been given some shocking orders. You mean you're going after the Straw Hats? Godspeed, Smoker commented. As much as I'm flattered by your lack of faith in me, that isn't the case. I was fully ready to go after them, but it seems my authority in this area has been overridden. As you can imagine, I'm rather disappointed. Hina disappointed. Smoker's brow furrowed. They're sending someone from HQ. I've seen you fight before and you're stronger than most rear admirals. The only reason you're still a captain is because of your supposed lack of experience. Who would they send that can do the job better? Hina blushed slightly. Smoker really could be charming when he wasn't trying to be. Well, that's the thing. They're sending the trio of disciples. Smoker's eyes widened slightly. You mean they're coming to this part of the Grand Line? But that's a huge waste of resources. Hina interrupted. Hina was surprised too. But it seems the higher-ups are convinced that we have to end this now, and so they've committed an excessive force to take them down. My orders are to back them up using my black cage formation, but not to get in their way. In short, Hina has been sidelined. Smoker thought for a moment as he let smoke from his cigar fill his lungs. Such an excessive display of force was unprecedented to go after a rookie in the first half of the Grand Line. But that's not what he was contemplating. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. Despite all his experience suggesting that there was no way Straw Hat was getting out of this alive, something in his very bones was telling him that his experience was wrong this time. Perhaps it was the lingering ache in them. Smoker? Are you still there? I had a feeling that you wouldn't be alright with this, but there's nothing you can do. Alright with what? Smoker asked. Well, with Straw Hat getting captured. I know you were dead set on being the one to bring them in. I figured you'd be miffed that you lost your chance. Smoker was silent for a moment as he blew out a puff of smoke. That's if he gets captured, he finally pointed out. He could hear a slight intake of breath on the other line. You're kidding. Against the students of the admirals. I know you've dealt with them before and know firsthand how strong they are, but are you seriously saying that 3 vice admirals isn't enough to? Like I said. Godspeed, Hina, Smoker interrupted, before hanging up. He sighed. Whether or not they realized it, the Straw Hats were walking down the road to infamy. And there were only a select few places where that road could lead. The morning after their celebrations, the Straw Hats were abruptly ripped from their slumber by Igaram, who burst into the room, shouting for them to wake up. Most of them groaned. What is it, curly old man? Luffy asked as he rubbed his eyes and yawned. He noticed the newspaper in the man's hand and had a pretty good guess what it was about, but at the moment, he really just wanted to keep sleeping. They had walked all night through the desert without resting, after all. What the hell did you all do? Igaram asked as he panted. You mean the defeating a royal warlord part or publicly humiliating the world government or both? Luffy asked sleepily. Robin chuckled at his attitude. No, not that. I'm talking about just look for yourself. He yelled as he threw the newspaper onto the ground. They all looked in curiosity as Nami quite forcefully woke up Zoro, the only one still asleep. Many of them gasped as they looked at the front page. Contrary to what they thought, Crocodile's defeat in the conspiracy in Alabasta had not made the headlines, although they could see that it was on the second page. What did you do indeed? Robin said, visibly shocked. Nami groaned. How could we have forgotten about that? She asked as she slapped her forehead. The headline, in big bold letters, read. Whitebeard declares Straw Hat pirates his allies. This is the end for today. Hope you enjoyed. If you made it here please comment below.